Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay, thank you, sir. DP ma'am, do we start or do we wait for a few more minutes?
Madhurila, you can start.
Okay, Didi. Good afternoon, everyone. Warren Hastings, the first Governor General of India, had written to the officials of the East India Company back home that in India things were different and people were guided by religion. In 1772, in order to preserve the fabric of the society, he had directed courts to base their judgments on law code of Manu. Much later, criticizing his predecessors for not initiating the novelty, Sir John Strachey, an English civil servant in British India, in his comprehensive survey of British Indian administration, wrote, "In the long run, social reform in India means a reform of caste." He later added, "Being based on religion, it, meaning caste, holds society in fetters, making true social life and progress impossible, leading to inequality, preventing unity and patriotism." Much has changed since then. However, the issues of class, caste, and religion still seems to be very relevant in India even today. Hence, we have gathered here for a webinar on class, caste, and religion in Indian governance contemporary scenario, which is organized by Department of Political Science and IQAC, Sarojini Naidu College of Government, Kolkata. Enough said, I would now like to invite a respected principal ma'am, Dr. Urmila Ukil, to deliver the formal welcome address. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you, Madhurila. Am I audible?
Yes, ma'am, you are.
Yes, ma'am.
Good afternoon, everybody. Honorable speakers, participants from different colleges and institutions, dear teachers, and my beloved students. On behalf of Sarojini Naidu College for Women, I extend a warm welcome to all of you to the one-day national level webinar organized by the Department of Political Science and IQAC of Sarojini Naidu College for Women. It is an honor for me to welcome all the eminent speakers. Dr. Devi Chatterjee, retired professor of International Relations, Jadavpur University. Dr. Aryan Guho, assistant professor of Political Science, Jamia Hamdard University. Dr. Partha Pratim Basu, professor, Department of International Relations, Jadavpur University. And Dr. Moidul Islam, assistant professor of Political Science, Center for Studies in Social Sciences, Calcutta. The speakers, despite their hectic schedule, cheerfully accepted our invitation to attend and share their knowledge and experience with us today. I am very grateful to them. I take this opportunity to thank all of them for gracing this occasion with their presence and participation. The theme of today's webinar is Caste, Class and Religion in Indian Governance, Contemporary Scenario. I express my appreciation to the Department of Political Science for choosing this sensitive subject as the topic of today's webinar. As we are all aware, Indian politics has long been shaped by caste, class, and religion that have been used as a political weapon, not only by the political leaders, but also by the groups to assert their rights and entitlements. Given the dynamic nature of Indian politics, it becomes important to understand the changing facets of caste, class, and religion and their impacts on Indian politics. The webinar today is an effort towards that direction and seeks to unravel the complexities underlying these factors and their relationship with the governance structure. I am sure that the deliberation today will enrich our understanding further and will help us to shed light on these critical factors of governance. I once again welcome all of you to this webinar and hope this webinar will be a grand success, and I hope you will all have an enriching and exciting session today. Thank you all. Thank you once again.
Thank you, ma'am. Now I would like to invite Dr. Devjani Bhattacharya, our senior most faculty member of the department and also the convener of the webinar, to share her introductory remarks. Devjani, ma'am.
Thank you, Madhuri Ratan. And good afternoon to all of you. Respected Principal Ma'am, Dr. Urmila Uki, my esteemed speakers, my colleagues, participants from other colleges, and my dear students. On behalf of the organizing committee, the IQAC, and the Department of Political Science, Sarojini Naidu College for Women, I take this opportunity to welcome you all to this one-day national webinar on a very broad theme, class, caste, religion in Indian governance, contemporary scenario. These three terms, class, caste, and religion, define India's plurality, diversity, and also affect each and every citizen, either directly or indirectly. Precisely, they somehow adversely dominate the lives of various communities in India. In fact, our society is a complex mix of customs and cultures, yet divided by caste religious beliefs. Though the majority believes in religious tolerance, yet we often witness intolerance here and there. 75 years on, since India's independence in 1947, we still nurture a class-based, caste-based, religion-based social system, or structure. Under such circumstances, I think this webinar will raise some critical questions about how India has managed to live together with these differences, discriminations, and challenges, how these have influenced India's social and political evolution, and whether the socio-economic realities can be changed in future and strengthen our governance. As the convener of this webinar, I have only tried to assemble the best minds who can share their thoughts on this theme very comprehensively, I believe, and thus enrich our perceptions. Thank you.
Thank you, Devjanidhi. Now I would request Dr. Shailendra Pradhan to introduce the speakers of the first session. However, please know that you can send in your questions and comments in the chat box, and participation certificates will be mailed on submission of the feedback form at the end of the webinar.
Hello, am I audible? Please let me know.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Thank you, Professor Arthur Basu. We have divided the seminar in two sessions. We'll take up two speakers in each session. We'll take a short break in between. The first speaker for this session is Devi Chatterjee, who has had a very distinguished career. She is a former professor of the Department of International Relations, Jadavpur University, where she taught for more than 30 years. She was also, at the same time, a visiting professor in the Department of Political Science, Rabindra Bharati University, and later at the Department of Human Rights and Human Development in the same university. Besides, she has also been a guest lecturer at the Department of Sociology and for Human Rights program under the Department of Anthropology at Calcutta University. Among her varied interests, her primary area of interest are studies relating to Indian society and social problems, human rights, and gender issues. Among her most important works are Color Volcano, Marxist Thought in India, Up Against Caste, a comparative study of Ambedkar and Periyar, among many others. She is also the editor of Contemporary Voice of Dalit since 2008, a journal published by Sage Publication. I now request Professor Devi Chatterjee to take over and to share her thoughts and deliberation on the theme today. Thank you, Devi Chatterjee. It's over to you.
Thank you very much. Am I audible?
Yes, ma'am. Very
yes,
much.
You are.
Good afternoon, everyone. It is indeed a great honor to be invited to this webinar today. And I must thank Honorable Principal Madam, the organizers of the webinar, for giving me this opportunity to share my views on this very important theme today. Initially, let me just go into the background a bit. Initially, I was thinking about speaking on caste. I was requested thereafter to shift my attention to religion, to which I agreed. Accordingly, I shall be speaking on religion and governance in India. Now, to start the discussion, I think what is very important for us is to understand the historic and demographic realities of India, a place where over thousands of years, people have come from different parts of the world, made it their home, and in the process, they have interacted with one another, come into conflict with one another, cooperated with one another, intermingled with one another. Different cultures, different religions, different population groups have thus made up what we know as India today. That's a reality I think we need to understand about the Indian scenario and India's population. Also, looking at another dimension, a more recent dimension of historical reality, is the history of the partition of India. That has also greatly impacted on Indian politics, Indian social relations, and feelings towards different communities. So looking at these different, we do not really have the time to go into details of this. I'm sure all of you are aware of the scenario. One, the intermingling of different peoples, the interactions, and the buildup of a rather heterogeneous population group in this region. And the other, the partition history, the realities of the partition, the trauma, and the politics, and everything that went with it, a massive refugee flow, and related issues that went with it. Now, today's population, today's India, with which we are familiar, about 80% of the population are Hindus. Around 20%, that means, are minorities, religious minorities. Of these religious minorities, again, the largest religious minority happens to be the Muslims, who are around 14% of the population. Others include the Christians, Sikhs, Buddhists, Jains, and others. So this is the population composition of today's India. This is another dimension, I think, that needs to be taken note of, the population demographic factor. Now, in my discussion, my focus will be on the Muslims. In view of the fact that they are the largest minority group, being the largest, and for other factors, politically, the most relevant in that sense, the most visible also as a minority group. So I shall take up the scenario of the Muslim population, who are victims, I would say, of both overt and covert violence. Now, when I say they're victims of overt and covert violence, I do not exclude other communities, because most of the other communities, to a greater or lesser extent, suffer from very similar problems. Now, looking at the constitution of independent India, the constitutional system has assured equal status and, at the same time, special provisions for minorities. Both are present in the Constitution. Equal status and, at the same time, special provisions for minorities. The philosophy of the Constitution, in essence, can be found in the Preamble. We are here all familiar, I presume, with the Preamble to the Indian Constitution, which speaks of democracy, which speaks of justice, which speaks of liberty, equality, and fraternity. Place the different communities on the canvas and think of how much of these they have really been able to gain over the years, over the decades, from independence, from the constitutional system coming into force till the present period of time. Very important in the Constitution are the provisions of Article 15, which prohibits discrimination on grounds of religion. Article 25, which gives the right to profess, practice, and propagate religion. Article 29, which protects the interests of minorities. Article 30, which speaks of rights of minorities to establish and administer institutions, educational institutions of their choice. In 1992, a National Commission for Minorities was established by law. 6 communities were identified as minorities by the Union government: Muslims, Christians, Sikhs, Buddhists, Jains, and Zoroastrians. In 2018, the National Commission for Backward Classes was established. Now, in the preamble, which I have already referred to, and which lays down the philosophy of the Indian Constitution, the word secular was not included in the original document. Its inclusion came much later. It was not included because it was believed that the provisions were there already in the constitutional document and it would be superfluous to include it. Whatever it is, the word secular did not find a place. But looking at the constitutional provisions, as I said, on the one hand, all communities enjoy the basic rights, the fundamental rights assured to citizens of the country. Irrespective of their religion, they enjoy it. At the same time, minorities' vulnerability is recognized, and the special provisions, which I have already referred to, have been incorporated so that the minorities can enjoy a position of equality and justice in the Indian constitutional system. Now, looking at this scenario, where do they actually stand? In 2005, the Sarchar Committee was appointed. It submitted its report in 2006. It was appointed by the Union government. And the findings showed that the Muslim population was far behind others in terms of education, employment, access to credit, social and physical infrastructure, political representation, etc. It emphasized the structural exclusion of the Muslim community. It highlighted the deficiency in the delivery of public goods. The scenario clearly showed that they were not enjoying a position of equality as was promised, expected, and anticipated. It was a very detailed study which showed us the grim realities of the scenario. From here, I shall move on to another report specifically of West Bengal. A report which was published by Association SNAP and Guidance Guild in association with Protichi Institute. The report was published in 2016. The title of the report was Living Reality of Muslims in West Bengal, a report. Living Reality of Muslims in West Bengal, a report. They covered 19 districts, urban and rural areas, and from the visualizing of the project to its completion, a period of about 4 years was covered, and an intensive survey was made. The ground realities of the scenario in West Bengal were sought to be highlighted. Now, it was almost a 400-page report, a very, very extensive study. I shall not go into details of that study, but I shall just point out a few aspects that were brought to our attention. It showed the high poverty level of the Muslim community. More than 3/4 of rural Muslim households had no land. They did not own land. Those who did own land, they owned a very small amount of land. As a result of this, there was essentially a precariousness of the households. Either no land or very little land put them in a situation of precariousness, as a result of which, again, many had to out-migrate for work. Compulsory migration resulted. Now, when they migrated for work, it is not that their living conditions really improved. Their economic conditions did not improve. So that was one dimension that we have to understand from this report. At another level, access to facilities was also not similar to other communities. The Muslim community's access to tap water was nearly found to be around 40% less than that of the overall population. I'm just throwing up some of the points that came out. As I said, almost a 400-page report which has details, but just some aspects which show the ground realities of the scenario. Muslim women's participation in higher education has been disproportionately small, just as their participation in skilled workforce has been very low. So this is the scenario, the All India scenario, the scenario in West Bengal. So let us not have illusions. Let us not have illusions that we have really reached a position where everyone is enjoying similar rights, similar facilities to public utilities and goods. Leaving aside the dimension of physical violence that takes place. I'm not going into that. I'm simply emphasizing the aspect of social exclusion, access to resources, poverty, access to services, etc. Now, the causes. Of course, tension. Tension has to be understood. What are the the underlying causes of the tension between the largest minority and the majority community. Stress in relations. Sometimes the tensions reaching points of violence, and other times the manifestations of tension is evident in all these points, through all these points. Now, one surely is differences of religion and religious practices, creating a divide. What is acceptable to one community is not acceptable to the other. Or for that matter, could be considered as even offensive by the other. If I place the cow in the middle of the story, for one community, it is God. For the other community, it is food. A point of intense, perpetual conflict. There are many other examples that could be cited. The historical factors, which I've already referred to, I'm not repeating those. The historical factors have been significant in creating tensions. I mentioned the partition. It's a long story to go into who was wrong, who was right, could it have been averted, and why the partition. That is not our concern here. The partition occurred, both communities were traumatized, both communities bear the load of that partition, the legacy of that trauma. Something that they have not been able to overcome for all these years. How it should be overcome, attempts should be made, a different story. But it persists. It's always saying that, well, you are responsible for my woes. Each telling the other, for all that I suffer, you are responsible. So that's another side of the story. Added to it has been the biased interpretations of history. History has very often been written with a purpose and with political purposes. It is hardly neutral history that we come by. As a result, I'm not saying necessarily it is wrong. What I'm saying is history provides us with a lot. When you do it with a political purpose, when you do it with the motive, you pick some, you leave out the others. History provides us with the story of the partition, the trauma of the partition. History tells us about the syncretic culture that India also shares. But very often, what is pushed aside is that syncretic culture, the sharing of the cultures, the influences of one on the other, that is pushed aside. The impact of one culture that is drawn from the other culture, music, art, food, cultural practices of Hindus, I would say, bears a lot of imprint of Islamic culture. That is a reality. Yet very often that is pushed aside and the partition story comes to the surface to show the conflict between two communities. As I said, I'm not going into interpretations. Similarly, a similar problem can be noticed in media reporting. Many stories are reported with reference to communal identities. As a result of which, certain stereotypes are encouraged. Whereas in those stories, the communal identity might be just one of many factors. But nevertheless, bringing it into focus, we find certain stereotypes are being encouraged. Now, the stereotyping of the other is a very common practice. And particularly when the other is not taken very well, this stereotyping takes place. To say that, well, they are like this, not like us, and thereby pushing them apart, pushing them to the fringes. Already an 80% and a broken, fragmented 20% puts them in an adverse position. Now, as you stereotype the minorities, the different religious minorities, and push them further, it is not a very difficult task. And that makes for their further exclusion in terms of access to goods and resources, in terms of access to the social space. Economic disparities have also been a factor which adds to the process of stereotyping. If I'm poor, I do not have access to good schools, good education, good workplaces, etc. The moment that happens, I get stamped by saying that, well, they are not capable of it. They do not want it. We are superior. So this happens, the economic disparities aggravate the processes of stereotyping. The games that political parties play have to be kept in mind in this context, the political factors. And over and above everything is the question of access to goods and services, on the one hand, by the dominant community, on the other, to ensure a pool of cheap labor who do not have access to goods and services on par. Now, under the circumstances, let us look at the political trends. I will try to keep it as brief as possible. From the 50s to 70s, if you look at the scenario, India's secular image was largely been nurtured, politically at least. And on the basis of that was the constitution's acceptance of secular principles, which again were largely governed by Nehru's ideas, Jawaharlal Nehru's ideas. From the 80s, the scenario has drastically changed. There has been a great reversal. As the BJP was formed in the 80s, in 98, the NDA government led by the BJP came to power at the center. In 2014, the BJP formed the government. In 19, it got a massive victory, and aggressive Hindutva and communal polarization was openly being propagated. India's identity was sought to be recast now openly as a Hindu nation. Attempts were being made to establish a homogeneous Hindu identity. I emphasize this because I had started the story by referring to India's heterogeneous culture. And from now on, what was being attempted was to create a homogeneous identity of India as a Hindu nation, which would naturally mean greater exclusion of any population group that does not fit into this scheme. The risks being, under the circumstances of gross human rights violations, they are clearly evident. Loss of India's identity that was built over centuries, the heterogeneous identity of India. The risks also of disintegration as the basics of India's identity were being questioned. And by marginalizing large sections of the population, India's attempt to achieve sustainable development goals would be obstructed. Because the sustainable development goals, as the UN and the World Bank have highlighted, involve participation, rule of law, transparency, inclusiveness, accountability, consensus, etc. And all these, or I would rather say each of these, would be under threat. How can you have good governance if these are the basic indicators of good governance? If these are the basic indicators of good governance on the basis of which we are going to have the sustainable development goals being promoted, we are moving away from the possibilities of attaining these. The solution, my final comments would be, the solution lies in increasing the democratic participation of minorities and making their voices heard and making their voices relevant. And finally, I would say that calls for a widening of the secular space in India. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Professor Debi Chatterjee, for your insightful talk and deliberation on the issue of religion and Muslim minorities in India. It was a very insightful account of the grim reality surrounding our Muslim population in India. You started by spelling out the provisions of Indian Constitution, how it guarantees equality, and how secularism has been the cornerstone of Indian politics, and how it's kind of been unable to deliver secularism or secular values and provide equality to the Muslims in India. I think that that's the takeaway point. And given how we are, kind of looking at the issue of religion in today's time, it becomes important for us to have a nuanced understanding of many other issues. So thank you for your time and talk, Devi Chatterjee, ma'am. If you have any question, I think Sweta have a query, and if you could kindly put that up. I'll read out the question posed by Sweta Singha, which is, I think, general in nature. She says, respected ma'am, whether it is social, economic or political reasons that is increasingly creating religious disparity, or is it the combination of all these factors? So, ma'am, if you could kindly respond to her.
Right. I would say it is a combination of all these factors that are operating to lead to the marginalization of the population, the minority groups.
True.
I think in the course of the discussion, I have pointed this out. Do you want me to explain this further?
Ma'am, I think if you could kindly elaborate on that, it would be helpful to our students. They are young, and I'm sure that they are very inquisitive. So
Right. Okay. I would say it is social because so far as, from the very beginning, the difference that they are not part of our community. They are not the same. They are not identical. They are not like us. They are different. This has been, this is constantly hammered into the minds of people from very childhood. When it comes to social interactions, these operate. So at the level of social interactions, the problem is there. I have already mentioned the fact that when you look at religious practices, they are different, very different. Going to religious places of worship, members of the other community would not be encouraged, would not be allowed to go to many of the other places of worship. From different communities, this operates in different degrees. Economically, basically, when you're looking at the economic side of it, there is an attempt by the majority, which is also the socially dominant group, which I said again is around 80% of the population, to have its control over the economy, the resources, to the maximum possible extent, and to exclude others from having access to even a limited share that they may be otherwise entitled to. And in this process, keeping them out would also ensure that you have a source of cheap labor. Something that happens even in the case of the low castes. Keep them as cheap labor. Who's going to do the hard work, the laborious work? Keep them uneducated in the formal sense of the term. Keep them poor and make them do the hard work. So they form the pool of cheap labor, putting in hard labor and being extracted of their resources. They do not have a voice. Their voice is pushed into the background. Because they are poor, because they lack formal access to formal places of power, the corridors of power, they are underrepresented politically, their voice is not heard as it should be heard. Politically, again, there is a very definite political line that I have referred to already that seeks to promote Hindu majority rule or control over this entire region, to establish not a secular India, but to establish a Hindu India. And that also comfortably in the short run would cater to vote bank politics. And that is what happens. So I would say all the three factors integrate. I would also add another point here, linking it up with caste, and say, if you look at India's Muslim population, the bulk, if I'm not mistaken, others might correct me if I'm wrong, the bulk, barring a small section, the bulk have converted from Hinduism at some or other point of time in history. Converted, again, not because of force, but converted in order to get out of a position of subordination in Hindu society because they belonged to the lower castes. Upper caste Hindus did not convert to Islam to that extent. Conversions, as I said, if I'm wrong, please correct me. Conversions, to a great extent, I believe, came from the lower castes to get out of the oppression of caste atrocities. So as they converted again, they carried the baggage of caste. Caste, class, and religion, the three things that you have brought in here, overlap and integrate at this point. Class exploitation, their earlier caste position and caste baggage that they are still carrying, and their present religious position with the historic legacies which I have already spoken about. That's it. I think.
Yes, ma'am, that was a very elaborative account of the of how these factors play out in reality and how one factor is connected to the other. So thank you very much.
Ma'am, sorry to come in. There are a few more questions if you would like to address. There are in the chat box. Shailendra, would you like to read them to ma'am?
Yeah, sure, Madhuri ma'am.
There is one question of Abhik Bhattacharya and Devyani.
Yeah, ma'am, the first question is by Abhik Bhattacharya. He writes, don't you think that the Constituent Assembly debates itself represent how the nationalist vocabulary eliminated the political safeguards for minorities? And then there is a few more additional questions. He says, he quotes one, Rachana Bajpai, who points out that the very essence of nationalist discourse was connected to a national unity grid that certainly reduced the space of minority recognition and shifted the discourse toward backward class. So don't you think today's situation of religious minority is deeply rooted in these histories? That is the question raised by Abhik Bhattacharya. Ma'am, in case if you want to respond to that.
Yes. The nationalist discourse was essentially also linked to the question of religion. At different points, the appeal was made to Hindu gods, Hindu idioms, consciously or unconsciously, with the purpose of drawing in the people of the Hindu communities into the movement, appealing to them. That was perhaps one factor. Maybe, I'm saying I do not know, maybe not directly to offend, but the result was an alienation. The result was an alienation in the nationalist movement. At different levels, this was done. Gandhi speaking about Ram Rajya. Who's Ram? What is Ram Rajya? So these were coming up. These at different levels. The Hindu identity factor was very prominent from pre-independence period. It was very much there in the Constituent Assembly debates. The lobbies were clearly operating. There, and there were different kinds of pulls and pressures at that point. But in spite of that, I would say the constitution that we have got, the document that came out of it, the document which came out, it did provide ample scope for fair play for the minorities. But the operational side, the implementation, again, if we look at it, we have fallen short on that point, clearly. Not that there was no scope for improvement of that document. Of course, there was scope for improvement on that document. But it did provide an adequate space for minority rights, safeguards, etc. But here we've got to remember that it is in a social system that the political system is really operating embedded. And that social system is reflecting a particular mindset, a dominant mindset. The political system is largely responding to it, falling in line with it, and reflecting it. It is not radically changing it. To radically change it, it would do it at its own risk of losing votes. And that explains, I would say, how a Hindutva party over a short period of time can become, within quotes, so popular in terms of votes, whereas, let us say, a party appealing on class lines like the communist parties failed to do that. What went wrong? What went wrong? So trying to change is much more difficult than trying to reflect or play to the tune of that social system that has been the dominant Hindu discourse. In the process, push out the others, which is a very unfortunate scenario for India, which I said, which has a very large heritage, a very, very heterogeneous heritage. And the India we know today has really been shaped not just by Hindus, but by Hindus, Muslims, Christians, Buddhists, etc. So it is everyone's India. But unfortunately, today we fail to recognize that or accept it.
Thank you, ma'am. The other question is by Devbani Ray Chaudhary. She is from Deshbandhu College for Girls. She writes in the context of Uniform Civil Code, and she says that in the absence of uniform civil code in the country, it could lead to polarization of vote bank, and that the political parties may use it to further their political interests rather than helping to usher in a more inclusive governance. So that was in the context of uniform civil code. So in case if you want to respond to that, ma'am.
Uniform civil code is a very, very tricky issue. I would say it's very tricky because on an abstract plane, if you ask me, I would say an uniform civil code is desirable. But in Indian context, at the moment, if you ask me, I would say no. I would say it is not desirable. For the simple reason that what it really boils down to, or what it's intended to boil down to, is to have a civil code dictated by the dominant group. It would not be it would be rather a stick to beat the others. So if we have a genuinely secular India, a genuinely democratic India, in that case, a uniform civil code would be welcome. But under the given circumstances, I think it would not be a welcome move. The moves should come from the communities themselves about changing their own practices to the extent that they feel desirable and when desirable. So that is my stand on the Uniform Civil Code, because now it becomes a very, very dangerous move when you add it up with the other factors. Trying to dictate to the minorities that, well, this is good for you in a milieu of dominance. That's about all I would say.
Yeah. Thank you so much, ma'am, for your talk and deliberation on the issue of religious identity. I think given how many of the things are happening in our country at the present time, it's very important that we talk about the rights of the minorities, particularly the Muslims who have been at the receiving end of many of the governmental schemes in the current time. So thank you, Professor Devi Chatterjee, for sparing your time and for your talk on religious identity in India. The other speaker we have today is Dr. Aryan Guha, who is already present. Dr. Aryan Guha is an assistant professor of political science at Jamia Hamdard, which is a deemed university located in New Delhi. Although an early career researcher, he is actively engaged in research and academics. He has had association with York Center for Asian Research, York University, Toronto, Canada, as an external research associate. He has written extensively and widely on questions of caste mobilization and identity politics. His writings have appeared in many of the reputed journals, including Economic and Political Weekly, Contemporary South Asia, Contemporary Voice of Dalit, and International Journal of Discrimination and Law. Amongst his many works, the forthcoming one is the book on caste politics in West Bengal, which will be published by Leiden and Boston. Thank you very much, Dr. Aryan Guha, for sparing your time with us today. It's all over to you. So you may just begin your presentation and talk. Thank you. Hello.
Okay, am I audible properly?
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you for the wonderful introduction, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me. And it is a great honor and privilege for me to share space with such eminent scholars. So the theme of the seminar is quite broad, caste, class, and religion. And this theme is quite well researched, well explored in contemporary social science in India. So it's very difficult to find a starting point for me. So where to start and which topic actually to speak upon. So what I will basically do today is that I will speak mostly on Dalit politics. And since the theme of the seminar is caste, class, and religion, so therefore I will try to relate Dalit politics with class and religion, mostly religion. So I will try to understand the relationship between Dalit politics and religion on one hand, broadly, and also the relationship between Dalit politics and class on the other hand. So what I will basically do is that I will divide my discussion into two parts. The first part will be the Dalit politics relationship with religion, and the next part will be the Dalit politics conceptualization or relationship with class. So I am not fully confident that whether I will be able to cover both the parts within 30 minutes. So I will start with the first part, and if time permits only, then I'll only discuss the second part, which will be a brief compared to the first part. So let's start with how Dalit politics has kind of conceptualized religion. There is not one single standpoint. Dalit politics is a kind of a juxtaposition of multiple standpoints. And they have conceptualized the role of religion and the position of religion with regard to Dalits in different ways. But it is possible to identify two basic or two major trends or standpoints within Dalit movement if we have to understand Dalit politics relationship with religion, particularly Hinduism in this context. One standpoint of Dalit movement I would call reformist standpoint, and the other standpoint I would call the radical anti-caste or the autonomous standpoint. So what is the difference between the reformist and the radical standpoint? The basic difference between the radical and the reformist standpoint of the Dalit movement is with regard to their contrasting approach towards Hindu religion. Now, the reformist Dalit politics or the reformist Dalit movement, it believes that in order to eradicate untouchability and caste division, it is possible to bring about certain reforms in the Hindu social order, and by bringing those reforms, it is possible to eradicate caste-related problems like untouchability, caste discriminations, caste divisions, etc. On the other hand, the radical standpoint that argues differently. It says that, or it believes that it is not possible to bring about simple reforms or incremental changes in the Hindu social order. And so in order to abolish untouchability and in order to annihilate caste, it is important to completely reject Hinduism and to embrace a new kind of identity. Okay, so that is basically the difference between the reformist and the radical standpoint within the Dalit movement, and this is with regard to their conceptualization of Hindu religion. Now, I will first talk about the radical standpoint within the Dalit movement. Now, the radical standpoint within the Dalit movement is mostly represented, or most famously represented by non-Brahmin movement in southern India, pioneered by Jyotiba Phule and Periyar, and then in Western India by the Ambedkarite movement, and also in the northern part of India by the Adi Dharma movement or the Adi Hindu movement, which was led by Achyutanand and Swami Achyutanand in northern part of India, that means in the present day Uttar Pradesh, and Manguram in Punjab. So these are basically the most prominent radical anti-caste movement. So both the non-Brahmin movement, which is more or less based upon Phule's ideology, and the Adi Dharma movement or the Adi Hindu movement of the northern part of India, both these movements were highly influenced by the Aryan invasion theory, which was propounded by the colonial sociologist as well as a British Orientalist. So they wholeheartedly accepted the central proposition of the Aryan invasion theory. So they basically claimed that the Aryans were the outsiders. They came outside of India, most possibly from the Central Asia, and they invaded India from the northwest, and then they spread to other parts of India. And after arriving at India, they kind of subjugated, conquered the indigenous people, the original inhabitants of the land. And after conquering them, they imposed their own culture, the Hindu civilization and the caste system upon the original inhabitants of the land. So that is basically their fundamental point they are making. And then they argue, and then they go kind of go forward, and then they argue that the Brahmins or the upper caste, they are basically the descendants of the Aryans, and the lower caste, Shudras, the Ati Shudras, the untouchables, the Dalits, they are basically the descendants of the original inhabitants of this land who were displaced, who were conquered, who were massacred and subjugated by the Aryans, or those who are the forefathers of the Brahmins. So what basically this ideology or this kind of approach towards a certain part of our history does is that it basically tries to invent a new identity for the untouchables or for the Dalits. For example, those who are the original inhabitants of this land in the Aryan invasion theory, they were termed by Phule as Dravidians, and that's why the non-Brahmin movement is called the Dravidian movement. And kind of Adi Dharma movement, that termed the original inhabitants of the land, basically those who are kind of Shudras and Dalits, they termed them as kind of Adi Dharmis or Adi Hindus. Okay. So what they basically try to do, they try to create a new identity for the lower caste. In case of the non-Brahmin movement, the identity is a Dravidian identity. And in case of the Adi Dharma movement, it is the Adi Dharma or the Adi Hindu identity. So that's how they create a different, or kind of invent a different alternative identity to the Hindu caste identity. So this is how the radical anti-caste movement try to overcome the subordination that caste system has imposed upon them. Now, Ambedkar also kind of goes down the same route, but not exactly the same route. Now, what Ambedkar does is Ambedkar does not believe in he does not accept the Aryan invasion theory. What Ambedkar does, Ambedkar also kind of tries to endows the untouchables or the Dalits with a new kind of identity, but it's a different kind of Buddhist identity. What Ambedkar claims was that the Dalits or the untouchables, they were basically the original Buddhist, and they did not return to the fold of Hinduism even when Buddhism declined. Furthermore, he also says that it was those Buddhist untouchables who later became untouchables, first they were Buddhists, they did not give up the practice of beef eating when the entire society gave up that practice under Brahminical injunctions. And as a result, the Brahmins, they imposed untouchability on the Buddhists, and those Buddhists later became untouchables and the Dalits. So what Ambedkar does, Ambedkar also creates a new kind of identity for the Dalits. And that identity is of a Buddhist identity, and later he also kind of urged all the Dalits to convert to Buddhism. So if we look at this radical anti-caste position, we'll find that the radical anti-caste position is basically an autonomous position, autonomous in the sense that it claims autonomy from the Hindu culture and the Hindu social order on one hand, and as an alternative identity to the Hindu caste identity, they try to create a new kind of identity, which in some cases is the Dravidian identity, in some cases it is the Adi Dharma, Adi Hindu identity, and in some cases it is a Buddhist identity. So this is how the radical anti-caste movement kind of looks at the question of religion. But though the radical kind of anti-caste movement tried to create a different kind of identity as an alternative to the Hindu kind of caste identity, in practice, those movements also kind of showed a great deal of ambivalence with regard to their relationship with Hinduism. Okay, now, for instance, the Adi Dharma or the Adi Hindu kind of movement that happened in Punjab and also in Uttar Pradesh, present-day Uttar Pradesh, now they claimed that the untouchables, they were basically Adi Dharmis and therefore they were not Hindus. Still, they derived all of their inspiration, all of their kind of spiritual inspiration from the Bhakti movement and the Bhakti tradition, and they also kind of derived their inspiration from a 17th century Bhakti poet Ravidas, who are basically safely placed, very securely placed within the overall Hindu tradition. And the same kind of dilemma we have also witnessed in case of the Buddhist, for example, the Neo-Buddhist movement. The Neo-Buddhists are those who are the followers of Ambedkar, who responded to the call of Ambedkar, and they converted from Hinduism to Buddhism. That the Neo-Buddhist movement, which is mostly confined to the Mahas in Maharashtra and to some extent Chatavs in Uttar Pradesh. Now, if we look at the Neo-Buddhist movement, we will find the same kind of dilemma. Now, here I will mention some of the most prominent, some of the important studies which have been done on this Neo-Buddhist. For example, Wayne Lynch has studied the Neo-Buddhist of the town Agra in Uttar Pradesh, and the Jatav Neo-Buddhist. And Wayne Lynch finds very interesting Wayne Lynch gives us very interesting observations. And Wayne Lynch finds that the Neo-Buddhist Jatavs in Agra, they claim themselves to be Buddhist, but they follow all the rites and rituals of traditional Hinduism. Okay. And then seeing their behavior, Lynch comes to the conclusion that this Neo-Buddhist Jatavs, they are Buddhist as well as Hindus, because Hinduism for them is a system of rites and rituals, while Buddhism for them is only a social philosophy. And this social philosophy of Buddhism is also different, which is very interesting, which Lynch argues that this social philosophy of Buddhism that they kind of accepted, that is very different from the traditional Buddhism, because for them Buddhism means the teachings of Ambedkar, not the original teachings of Buddha. So therefore Buddhism for them is basically a social philosophy, it's not a religion, while they abide by the Hindu rites and rituals. And another study has been done by Neera Buddha, and that study is on the neo-Buddhist Mahars in Maharashtra. And Buddha also kind of finds more or less similar reality there. Buddha also finds that in almost all the households of the neo-Buddhist Mahars, there are images of Ambedkar, Buddha, but as well as images of all Hindu gods and goddesses. And there is a continuing prevalence of Hindu rituals among the neo-Buddhist Mahas. And therefore, Buddha argues that the Buddhist rites and rituals of the Buddhist religion has not been integrated at all in the everyday lives of the neo-Buddhist Mahas. And therefore, but Buddha also notes that there is also a change of self-perception, a self-perception in the sense that the neo-Buddhist Mahas, they in the publicly they declare that they are Buddhist, but when they call themselves Buddhist, as Buddha finds out, when they call themselves Buddhist, they do not basically reject Hinduism, but what they basically do is that they signal to the higher caste that they are no longer untouchables. Okay, so basically, therefore, Buddha argues that the inner core of their consciousness still remains Hindu while they publicly claim themselves to be Buddhist. And another study, another very interesting study I will mention here is Nicholas Joul's study, and Nicholas Joul has kind of studied the radical Dalit Panthers activist in Kanpur, and Joul finds out very interesting. Joul gives us a very interesting observation after studying the neo-Buddhist Mahas, neo-Buddhist Chatters of Kanpur town. So they were basically radical activists of the Dalit Panther movement. They're basically Chatters concentrated in Kanpur. So Joul finds out that in the households of even the staunch supporters of the Dalit Panther movement, the radical Dalits, even in their household, during the marriage ceremonies, which he particularly focuses upon, during the marriage ceremonies, all Hindu rites and rituals are performed along with neo-Buddhist rituals, and the women of the household, during all Hindu occasions, they go to the temples and they perform all the Hindu rites and rituals, often defying the diktats of the male members of the society. So, and another important observation or another important insight that Joul gives is that he also finds out that in the discourse, in the socio-political discourse of the radical Dalit Panthers, they also retain the traditional figures of Hinduism. For example, the day on which Ambedkar converted to Buddhism, which is a day which is called by the neo-Buddhist the Bodh Diksha. Now, the day of Bodh Diksha is celebrated as a day of Ravan Mela in Kanpur by the radical Dalit Panther activists. Now, therefore, Joul basically argues after this that even if they proclaim their disassociation from Hinduism, from the grand tradition of Hinduism, but even their opposition to Hinduism is also rooted in selective appropriation and selective inversion of the ideas and the images taken from the grand Hindu tradition. So the point that, therefore, the point that I'm making, and this scholars who have done a great deal of work on these castes, they are making is that though a complete discursive disassociation from Hinduism is yet to take place, and the radical anti-caste movement, though it declares its autonomy from the Hindu caste tradition, but in reality, it has failed to achieve a complete divorce from the Hindu kind of tradition and the Hindu social order. So therefore, the radical anti-caste movement in practice is also not completely free from the hegemonic influence of the Hindu culture and the Hindu society. So that's basically a kind of we can therefore find. Okay, so we can therefore find. I think someone's audio is not muted, and I'm getting some sound. Okay, am I audible? Can you hear me?
Yes, very much.
Yeah.
Please continue.
So So basically, what I'm trying to point out with regard to the Dalit movement relationship with religion, that it is quite ambivalent. Ambivalent even in case of the radical Dalit movements. It is ambivalent in the sense that in theory they proclaim a kind of complete autonomy from the Hindu culture, but in practice the break from the Hindu culture is still a kind of fragmentary break. It's not a complete break. Now let us understand the reformist caste movement. The reformist caste movement, as I have already highlighted, it believes in reforming the Hindu social order in order to eradicate caste divisions, caste discrimination, untouchability, and other problems. Now, the classic example of reformist caste tradition is, of course, the Gandhian Harijan movement. The Harijan movement of Gandhi it can be seen as a classic example of the reformist caste movement, and various caste associations and caste federations that came up in the early 20th century and in the mid 20th century. They more or less function, more or less, not all, but more or less, particularly northern India, they more or less functioned within this overall framework of the Hindu caste reform movement. But in today's time, the dominant you can say the dominant trend or the dominant pattern of the Hindu caste reform movement or the reformist Dalit movement is represented by the Hindu nationalist or the Hindutva politics or Hindutva kind of movement. So I will kind of devote some amount of time to understand how the Hindutva politics or the Hindutva movement, which is a reformist caste movement, looks at the question of caste. Now, in this context, the first thing that needs to be highlighted is that the principal goal of the Hindutva politics or the Hindu nationalists is Hindu unity. Okay, so therefore, the Hindu nationalists, they seek to eliminate all kinds of distinctions among the Hindus in order to transform them into a politically powerful and politically united community. So that is basically the goal of the Hindu nationalists or the Hindutva movement. Now, caste division therefore kind of becomes a kind of an hindrance to the realization of this goal. It becomes a hindrance to the realization of this goal because of caste divisions, the Hindu unity is not possible. Okay, so the Hindu nationalists have always favored. Okay, the Hindu nationalists have always favored caste reform movement in order to integrate the untouchables into the Hindu social order more deeply and prevent the possibility of their conversion into other faiths. So that has been historically the position of the Hindu nationalist movement. Now, the leadership base of the Hindu nationalist movement, if you look at the leadership of the RSS, leadership of the Hindutva politics, you will find that predominantly the leadership comes from, historically, if we look at, then we'll find that historically the leadership of the Hindu nationalist movement has come from the upper caste, mostly the Brahmins. Okay. And if you look at the RSS, all the RSS chiefs from Gol Volkar to Mohan Bhagwat, all of them were Brahmins except Rajendra Singh, who was the RSS chief in 90s. So, and he was he was a Thakur, he was a Khatriya. So the leadership base has remained dominated by the upper caste, and there is also a predominance of the Brahmins within that upper caste kind of ecosystem. But when it comes to the agenda of the Hindu nationalist movement, it has kind of encouraged and favored caste reform because they believe that caste reforms is necessary in order to integrate the untouchables into the Hindu social order. Now, let me give you some examples or some instances in order to kind of justify or kind of make sense of what I am basically trying to argue here. Now, for example, in 1921-22, in Malabar, there was a major riot, and in the Malabar riot, just after the Khilafat movement, there was a major riot in Malabar. In the Malabar riot, there was a mass conversion of the Hindus, and there was a Hindu massacre that took place, a bloody Hindu massacre. And after the Malabar riot, B.S. Munje wrote a report on the Malabar riot. Who is B.S. Munje? Now, B.S. Munje is basically the mentor. He's a mentor, he's a guru of Hedgeyar, who is the founder of the RSS. And B.S. Munje was also the president of the Hindu Mahasabha during 1920s, a large part of 1920s and 1930s. So this very important figure in the Hindu nationalist movement. Now, B.S. Munje, in a report of the Malabar riot, B.S. Munje writes that that the Hindus are suffering this fate because they are not united like the Muslims, and they are not united like the Muslims because because there is a caste system. And what is the solution? Therefore, Munje argues the solution is intercaste marriage, the Anulom Vivaha and the Pratilom Vivaha. So intercaste marriage. Munje says that we have to promote intercaste marriage in order to create a Hindu fellow feeling, in order to create a Hindu consciousness before different castes, because intercaste marriages can only bind different castes. Okay, now Ambedkar is also talks about intercaste marriage, and Hindu nationalists are also talking about intercaste marriage now, but kind of the goal is different. Now I will come to that in a while. So then now let's look at Savarkar. Now Savarkar wrote a very interesting essay. The title of the essay is 7 Shackles of Hindu Social Order. Now in this essay, Savarkar writes that the greatest impediment to the Hindu Rashtra is caste system, because caste system has injected eternal conflict between the Hindus and prevented their unity against external threat. So that is the Savarkar's position, and you can find that Munje and Savarkar almost takes a similar position. Now, and this is the position that has prevailed over the years. Now, for example, in 1974, the then Sarsanchalak of the RSS, or the RSS chief, who was Balasaheb Deoraz. Now, Balasaheb Deoraz in 1974 gave a speech, and this speech is considered to be one of the most important speeches ever delivered by a RSS chief within the kind of RSS history. So, in that speech, Balasaheb Deoraz very categorically says that untouchability is a sin, and he also argues that untouchability is basically a sin because it has fragmented the Hindu unity, it has created divisions within the Hindu unity. And in this connection, it also has to be understood that it is not only at the level of ideology, but also at the level of organization that the Hindu nationalists have long been working in order to integrate the untouchables into the Hindu social order. Now, the Depressed Classes Association, which is one of the most oldest all India Dalit organization, founded in 1915, the Hindu Mahasabha has a very strong association. In fact, this association in 1915 was founded by two of the most prominent Dalit Dalit activists of those times before the arrival of Ambedkar on the scene. They were Gavai and Bansode. Now, Gavai and Bansode were the most prominent Dalit activists of the early 20th century in Maharashtra, and they later joined Hindu Mahasabha. And they founded the Depressed Classes Association. They were quite active in Prarthana Samaj. They were also very closely associated with V.R. Sindhe's Depressed Classes Mission, which was also a very prominent organization which was working for the welfare of the untouchables in the early 20th century. And V.R. Sindhe was also one of the towering figures of the Dalit movement of the early 20th century in Maharashtra before the emerges Ambedkar as a pan-Indian or even a Maharashtrian leader in the mid and the late 1920s. So what I'm trying to basically point out that it is not only at the level of ideology, but at the level of organizations also, the effort to bring about social reforms in order to integrate the untouchables into the Hindu social order more and more deeply has been continuing since long, and we can trace it even to the early part of the 20th century. And if you now look at even the current organizational pattern in this context, you will find that there are many organizations which kind of RSS has created in order to work among the untouchables and the tribals. For example, the Samajik Samskra Manch, which has been created in order to foster a dialogue between the upper caste and the lower caste. Then there is Seva Bharati that works that kind of do a lot of welfare activities among the poor and the Dalits. And then there is Banvashi Kalyan Ashram, which works for the welfare of the tribal. So now the question is how they kind of Hindu nationalists are also kind of talking about Hindu caste reforms, but how they are different from the others. Now, in this connection, it has to be kind of outlined that their reformist spirit is limited by the fact that in the Hindu nationalist discourse, the Hindu unity, the question of Hindu unity gets priority over the question of caste reform. That means caste reform in the Hindu nationalist discourse is subordinate to the goal of Hindu unity. So therefore, if caste feelings and the caste consciousness is a problem towards the growth of a unified Hindu social order, then it becomes a problem. But if caste feelings and caste consciousness are not hindering the growth of national unity and Hindu unity, in that case, feelings engendered by caste may not be that of a problem. So, kind of, in other words, it can be said that for the Hindu nationalist, the the caste reform is only a means to the larger end of Hindu unity. It is not an end in itself. And this is where it is different from the Ambedkarite movements. For example, for Ambedkar, the annihilation of caste is an end in itself. It is a goal important enough to be pursued for his own sake. But for the Hindu nationalist, the goal of caste reform is only subordinate to the goal of Hindu unity, and not only subordinate, it is a means to the larger end of Hindu unity. So this is how they are different, but they are also kind of talking about caste reforms. So therefore, if I kind of summarize whatever I have discussed till now, the two major points can be identified. I think one is that we can divide in order to understand Dalit movements or Dalit politics relationship with Hinduism. We can identify two major trends. One is the reformist trend and one is the radical trend. And both of these trends to some extent have drawbacks, and they are kind of, to an extent, they are problematic. The radical trend, while it proclaims its independence and autonomy from the Hindu social order, but in practice, the break from the Hindu kind of ecosystem is not complete, and therefore there is a difference between the theory and the praxis. And when it comes to the reformist caste tradition, we'll find that in the reformist caste tradition, the goal of caste, the goal of caste reform, or the goal of eradication of untouchability, caste discrimination, and all of these goals are subordinate to the larger goal of Hindu unity. And therefore, if there is a conflict between these two goals, then of course the larger, the more fundamental goal prevails. So this is my analysis of the Dalit politics relationship with religion. Now, I think if I have time, now I can very briefly discuss Dalit politics relationship with class, how Dalit politics has addressed the question of class. So do I have time?
If you can be very brief about it, yeah, sure, please go ahead. We can have another 10 minutes of discussion.
Okay. Thank you. So let's then look at the Dalit movements, how Dalit movement has broadly, it's very broad, of course, how it has approached the question of class. Now, let's look at this, how it has approached the question of class. Now, it is generally nowadays widely acknowledged that Dalit politics has largely ignored the issue, the economic issues, and they have mostly focused upon cultural issues, identity concerns, and symbolic gains. And what has basically happened is that the focus has entirely been on the achievement of social dignity and kind of social pride, swabhiman. So the focus has been more on this, and therefore the issue of class has remained largely unaddressed. Now, if you look at the discourse of Dalit politics in the colonial times, in that discourse, if you look at that discourse, we'll find that there is no independent analysis of the economic structure of the society, or there is kind of no outlining of the economic agenda for the Dalits. Now, if you look at, for example, Phule's ideology, Phule does not have an economic agenda. Phule does not analyze the economic question that is also related to the caste question. So they did not. So the Dalit activists, they basically took the question of class for granted, and they failed to produce a holistic analysis which will combine the economic dimensions of caste as well as the social and cultural dimensions. So, but Ambedkar was kind of aware that class issues are also important, and Ambedkar was possibly the only Dalit activist who gave some amount of attention to the class-related and the economic issues. And for example, in the late 1920s, one of the major preoccupation of Ambedkar was the demand for the abolition of the Vatan land. The Vatan land was basically a practice which was related to the Mahas of Maharashtra. They were they were allotted a land, and they had to that is a Vatan land. They were attached to that land, and they had to cultivate that land for generations, becoming kind of village servant, a kind of serf. So Ambedkar wanted to abolish the system of Vatan land, and in late 1920s, one of the major issues that Ambedkar raised was the abolition of the Vatan system, or the Vatan land system. And it also needs to be outlined that the first political party that Ambedkar formed in 1936 was the Independent Labour Party. Now, it is a class-based party. The goal of the party was to fight for the interests of the peasants and the workers. So, and this party was the most successful political endeavors of Ambedkar. We know that Ambedkar formed later Scheduled Caste Federation, then he formed Republican Party, but this is a party which was successful electorally, the most successful party formed by Ambedkar. And in 1937 election, it was the biggest opposition party in Bombay Legislative Council, and I think it won 14 seats out of 17 it contested. So, and in the 1930, 38, 39, Ambedkar was also collaborating very actively with the communists. And the major demand that the ILP raised was the abolition of the Khoti landlord system. That was a very oppressive landlord system that was prevalent in the Konkan region of Maharashtra. And this issue was taken up with a great deal of enthusiasm. And Ambedkar also organized, Ambedkar along with the communists also organized a massive rally of 25,000 peasants and the tenants. And it is considered to be one of the largest rally of peasants in the pre-independence times. And it was also a demonstration of the caste and class, the combined struggle of caste and class. So Ambedkar gave some amount of attention, of course, to the class-related issues. And even in 1948, he submitted a memorandum to the Constituent Assembly, which is known by the name States and Minorities. And it also has a kind of a portion in which Ambedkar talks about his economic vision, and he talks about the nationalization of the key industries, the nationalization of land, the nationalization or declaration of agriculture as a state industry, redistribution of land, distribution of waste land and forest land among the untouchables. So Ambedkar did have kind of an economic vision, but there were some contradictions also. There were some contradictions and inconsistencies also. For example, in 1942, Ambedkar dissolved the ILP, that is the Independent Labour Party. He dissolved it and he created a narrow Dalit-based political party, Scheduled Caste Federation, which will only work for the interests of the Dalits. Now, it also has a context because Ambedkar felt that independence was coming, independence was very near, so it was better now to fight for the interests of the Dalits only, concentrate only on them, and the party raised the demand of separate electorate. That was Ambedkar's major agenda in the 1940s. So he basically kind of abandoned the class-related struggle for a very narrow kind of caste-related struggle in the early 1940s. And there is another major inconsistency which has been pointed out, for example, by Anand Teltumbde in his writing. Now, Anand Teltumbde writes that in 1936 or in the 1937, Ambedkar is leading some radical struggles, for example, struggle against the Khoti landlord system. He is raising the interest of the workers and the peasants as a chief of the Independent Labour Party. But in the 1936 also, Ambedkar is writing Annihilation of Caste. And in the Annihilation of Caste, Ambedkar is writing that the solution to the problem of caste lies in only one. The main solution for the problem of caste lies in the complete rejection of the authority of the Hindu Dharma Shastras. So now Teltumbde argues that now Ambedkar is leading a struggle of peasants and workers. At the same time, when he's writing Annihilation of Caste, he is emphasizing too much on the non-material aspects. And he is ignoring caste system as that. He's ignoring the political and the economic basis of the caste system, and only focusing on a social and non-material dimension when he's arguing that it is only by rejecting the Hindu Dharma Shastras, we can get rid of caste, we can eradicate caste. So, and so there are some kind of contradictions also, but yes, but Ambedkar did have an economic vision, and he understood that in order to uplift the untouchables, social cultural struggle has to be launched against untouchability, but at the same time there has to be an economic struggle for the betterment. Now let's come back now. But if we look at the Dalit movement of the present times, now present times Dalit movement, the one of the major kind of problem or the drawback of the present time Dalit movement that it has focused solely on the issue on symbolic issues, and it has bypassed economic issues to a large extent. Now here I will finish by pointing out some of the observations which I will kind of borrow from Sudha Pai, because Sudha Pai has done an extensive amount of work on the BSP, on BSP in Uttar Pradesh and the BSP movement in Uttar Pradesh. And after analyzing the BSP ideology and after analyzing the BSP performance during their governance, Sudha Pai makes certain important observation, I think, which are relevant in the context of our discussion today. So Sudha Pai says that now that BSP claims in itself to be kind of an inheritor of the legacy of Ambedkar, but Ambedkar understood the economic potential of the state or the government, and he understood the economic potential of the state and the government. That's the reason why he called for state socialism. He called for nationalization of key industries, which are all kind of all solutions are contained in the state and minorities, which I just talked about. But BSP completely focuses upon the acquisition of political power, and Kashiram very famously asserted that that political power is political power is the key that can unlock everything. So they basically focused upon political power, and Kashiram also once kind of commented, possibly in his book, which is The Chamcha Age or The Age of the Stooges. Now Kashiram comments in that book that economic kind of poverty or economic powerlessness is basically comes or kind of is a product of the political powerlessness. So in order to redress economic powerlessness, it is necessary to gain political power. So for problems relating to economics, no economic remedies are necessary. You just gain political power and all your economic problems will get solved. And then there is also a disproportionate, Sudha Pai argues that there is also a disproportionate amount of importance that has been given to various symbolic issues. For example, organization of Ambedkar Parks, organization of Periyar Melas, and an erection of huge statues of Ambedkar. So these are basically symbolic steps which have been taken, but there is no clear-cut economic agenda. There is no agenda for land reform. There is no concerted intervention in the health and the education system for the Dalits. So these are basically the kind of the drawbacks which we can find in the modern Dalit movement, that it has mostly focused upon the symbolic issues, the acquisition of political power, but the economic issues have not been given the amount of importance it deserves. And there are various anthropological studies also which also kind of argue. For example, I can mention the studies by Jeffrey and Jeffrey, which points out simply that though because of the BSP being in power, a new group of Dalit political leaders has emerged in the village areas, but the traditional economic structures remains intact because the land owners are still the dominant class. Landowners are still the Jats and the other dominant class, and because they own land, they have a great deal of control over the lives of the Dalits still, and therefore simple political empowerment or some political representation cannot redress the structural problems of which already kind of afflicted the economic and the social order. So I will I think I will stop here because I've taken so much of time. If there are any observation and questions, I can see some questions in the message box. If it can be read out, because I'm using my phone, I cannot see the questions.
Thank you, Dr. Aryan Gua, for your very nuanced account of caste identity. You started by talking about two trends, One was Dalit movement, including radical Dalit movement, and the tensions and inconsistencies within, and how they've not been able to completely break away from the Hindu caste, structure. The other one was the Reformist movement and how Hindu, Reformist movement kind of subordinate caste discrimination against Hindu unity. And you also took up the issue facing caste issue in the current political scenario. So I think that was a very nuanced and elaborative account, and we would like to thank you very, very much for your time. I would like to pass on the baton to my colleague Unmona Dhar, who is going to take up the the other station question and answer. So it's over to you, Unmona ma'am.
Thank you. Thank you, sir. Thank you so much, sir. Sir, to Dr. Oyon Guho, sir, I would like to point out some questions which is posted in the comment box by the participants, especially from Obhik Bhattacharjee. Dr. Guho, he is saying that what do you think about the merger of radical and reformist Dalit voices in the current political contest against a singular other, Muslims? Ghansham Shah and Burman in the recent works have showed how Dalits have been working as a foot soldiers of Hindutva project. They have referred to Muslims as a new untouchables. In this context, would you call it a discursive reassociation of Dalits with the broader discourse of Hinduism? There have been several studies that point to such consolidation, sir. And there are a few questions from our students of the department, which I can sum up like they are asking about the caste, whether a caste is an instrument of electoral politics in Indian scenario or not. And sir, I have to add on to that in terms of West Bengal. That is, till now, we have seen that in North India, caste play a decisive role in the political scenario, in the political discourses. But is it true for West Bengal in the near future? Can caste be a decisive factor in West Bengal politics? Do you see any future in that case? So you can refer to the following questions for the observation which is put forward by Obhik Bhattacharya 5 minutes ago. Thank you, sir.
Okay, thank you, Avik, for the question. It's a very, very complicated and very complex issue which you have raised. First of all, it's kind of difficult to answer because I need to kind of first know what are the evidences that will justify the argument which you are making. Because there is an argument I think you are making that there is a merger of radical and the reformist caste leaders, and therefore the new oppositional category for them is the Muslims. So first of all, I think I need to kind of understand that which reformist caste leaders or caste organization or which radical caste organization you are speaking to. As I have already highlighted, that if we look at the kind of Hindu nationalist discourse, so in the Hindu nationalist discourse, I think someone posted some, because I can't see because I'm using my phone. So in the what I just argued, that in the Hindu nationalist discourse, the oppositional other or the oppositional category has always been the Muslims. So therefore, the rationale or the logic for caste reform comes from the necessity of guarding against the threat that is perceived from the oppositional other, which in this case are the Muslims. So therefore, when they talk about caste reform, the logic of caste reform to a certain extent or to a large extent that comes from the insecurity that they feel from their oppositional other, which is the Muslims. So now the question is, now you possibly what you are trying to refer to, I think that there are maybe some radical who earlier used to be a radical anti-caste activist. They now are joining the Hindutva fold. Now, but the problem is that if those radical anti-caste activists they join the Hindutva fold, then they are accepting the rules of the game which are formulated by the Hindutva forces. So they are not retaining their ideology. They no longer remain a radical anti-caste activist. So therefore they get absorbed into the you can say the Hindutva politics. So in that case, can we call it a merger, or can we call it a kind of an acceptance of a hegemonic framework which is becoming hegemonic? So that's I think the theoretical questions regarding that. But yeah, to an extent, you can say that yes, the conflict between the upper caste and the lower caste, okay, or even the conflict between the lower caste and the dominant caste. If we look at the social in the social scenario and going beyond the caste leaders or the caste organization, if you just look at the society, for example, okay, so there is a consolidation. There is a consolidation that you have to kind of accept, that there is a consolidation, Hindu consolidation, and Hindu consolidation means that the caste which earlier used to be in a very adversarial relationship, who kind of used to see each other as antagonistic forces, now they come together. Okay, so for example, if you kind of look at for example the scenario, the UP scenario, for example, so there is kind of in Bihar and UP there is a conflict, or historically there is a conflict between the dominant caste and the lower caste, the untouchables and the lower caste, the untouchables and the dominant castes. So for example, dominant caste, when I'm talking about dominant caste, I'm talking about the Yadavs, I'm talking about the Jats, okay, and when I'm talking about the lower caste, I'm talking about the Jatavs, the Pasis. So now historically there was a kind of antagonism that prevailed between these two categories, the dominant caste and the lower caste, and this is because of the land relations, because the kind of Jatavs and other lower castes, they were basically kind of either marginal farmers or landless farmers, while the land was mostly in the possession of the middle castes, or the Jatavs or the Yadavs and the Jats. So there is a kind of economic context to this. But yes, now there is a kind of consolidation where we are seeing that the dominant caste and the lower caste are coming together, and they're coming together on the plank of the Hindutva politics. Okay, so those castes who earlier used to compete with each other, now they are somehow coming closer, and they are somehow getting consolidated as a unified Hindu bloc, and therefore the primary kind of the oppositional category shifts. The oppositional category for the Yadavs are no longer Jatavs, or for the Jatavs, the oppositional category no longer remains the Yadavs, and it becomes kind of a religious category, a religious oppositional category. So that kind of consolidation is taking place. I think that is something that is quite problematic, but that is something that's happening. Yeah, the next question is, I think the one question was regarding the future. Yeah, yes.
Yes, sir. The next question was regarding the future of caste politics in West Bengal. Okay. What is your observation in this regard?
Okay, now whether caste politics will play as much a role as it played in northern part of India. Now that's, I think, is a question. Now it's very difficult to tell, because
yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Yeah. So it's difficult to tell. This is because it will, if I say yes or no, I will basically not be doing political science, but I will be doing political astrology. So it's difficult to tell. Yeah, but what I will basically underline here, that the social structure of northern India and the social structure of West Bengal are not very similar. Okay. So caste can play an enhanced role. Okay, so but even if caste plays an enhanced role, it is difficult to say, or it is difficult to kind of presume that the caste will play an important role, or the caste will play a role in the same way it played a role in the North Indian politics, because the social structure is not same. Now, even now in the northern in part of India, the caste played a role in the electoral politics. Okay, when from the late 1917 onwards, we see a rise of OBC politics and the rise of dominant caste politics, and we also see a rise of Dalit politics. Okay, now all of these developments happened together. So there was an assertion, there was a caste assertion by different castes which happened at the same time during northern part of India in the 1970s, 1980s, and in the 1990s. Now, the problem of such a thing happening in West Bengal lies in a number of structural factors. The first, there are many structural factors which may kind of prevent such great assertion of by different castes, Dalits, dominant caste, and others. Now, it's a long discussion. My forthcoming book basically addresses all of these issues. Now, I will briefly highlight 2 or 3 major points. First is it's a demographic factor. Okay, so for example, in northern part of India, you will find dominant caste. There are many dominant castes. For example, the Jats are dominant class, the Yadavs are the dominant class. Then there are even we can say the Rajputs to a certain extent are dominant class. Now, this caste, they are a dominant class, but in the West Bengal context, it's difficult to find a dominant class because there is caste fragmentation in demographic terms, which means that there is, apart from Mahishyas, which kind of constitute 10% of the population, close to 10% of the population, there is no other middle caste or intermediate caste which has such a kind of demographic strength. Okay, so all of the middle caste have a demographic strength in the range of 3 to 4%, which is not adequate to implement a politics, the dominant caste politics. Okay, and even you look at the lower caste, or even you look at the untouchable caste, for example. Okay, the largest untouchable caste or the largest Dalit caste in West Bengal are the Rajbanshis, which are kind of 4% of the population. Then there is Nomoshudros, which is 3.84% of the population. So their demographic strength is not as much as the demographic strength of some of the lower castes in other parts of the country. For example, if the Jatav, which is the mainstay of BSP politics, if you look at the kind of Jatavs, almost kind of 10%, around 10% of the population of the UP. So, and then there is also a question of demographic distribution, how the castes are demographically distributed. Okay. Now, if you look at, for example, the Nomoshudros are mostly distributed they're mostly concentrated in North 24 Parganas and Nadia. Okay. Rajbanshis are mostly concentrated in a part of North Bengal. Now, but if you look at, for example, Jatavs, they are evenly distributed throughout Uttar Pradesh. Now, so we also have to look at these demographic factors. So if a caste is not as huge as is required for it to play a role in the electoral politics, and if its concentration is only in few places, then the possibility of caste mobilization in electoral politics diminishes. So that's one point. Then there is also a factor of political culture. The political culture of northern part of India and the political culture of West Bengal are largely different. West Bengal has a tradition of class-based politics because the left kind of put in motion a class-based politics. And so it has a kind of a tradition of class-based politics. Most importantly, what happened is that which Daipan Bhattacharya has written quite extensively, is a party society. So in northern part of the country, while social organizations like caste, religion, they have a kind of autonomy from the political order, in West Bengal, it is a party which dominates the social organizations. Okay, so the party is so dominant for whoever is the party, whatever be the party. Okay, the party, the ruling party, basically, it becomes so dominant that it kind of the role for the social organizations like caste and the religion, that becomes a very kind of that becomes very minor. So because the party society, so what Daipan Bhattacharya argues that the elementary institution of rural life in West Bengal is not caste, not religion, it is party. Okay, so and we can see also this in northern part of India, we'll see caste violence. Okay, you will see frequent caste violence, frequent communal violence. But in West Bengal, you come to West Bengal, you see political violence. So the violence occurs not over caste affiliation. The violence occurs over party affiliation. So there is a fundamental difference between the North Indian politics, North Indian society, and West Bengal society. So I think my sense is that caste may play a enhanced role compared to the role it played earlier, but to say that it will play such a role in the same way as caste played a role in northern part of India, or it will play as big a role as it played in northern part of India, I think I will say possibly not.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Guha, for your time and for your wonderful presentation. It is true that issues of class are adding the idea of India, where people have lived together, have been, as Dr. Chatterjee has pointed out, is an idea which needs to be protected now more than ever before. And having a comprehensive approach while understanding caste class link is crucial. And then we'll meet again. Please don't leave us. We'll be back right after 2 minutes. Thank you. Thank you once again, Dr. Professor Chatterjee. Thank you, Dr. Guha, for your time.
Thank you, organizers, for inviting me, and thank you all the participants for bearing me for such a long time. Okay, so I think, can I leave now?
Yes, if you need to, please. Yeah, you can.
Okay, thank you.
Professor Basu, we will just start after 2 minutes. We are just taking a very short break. Sir, is it okay if we start after just 2 minutes? We'll take a very short break, sir.
Yes, no problem.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back. We will begin our second academic session, but however, a little bit of change. That is, we will take question and answers, or rather, the question and answer session would commence after the presentation by the second speaker, which is Dr. Badul Islam. So, for this session, I would request my colleague, Shujata, to introduce our speakers. Over to you, Shujata.
Thank you, Madhurata ma'am. As we move forward with the program, I want to take this opportunity to introduce our distinguished speakers for this session. First, I would like to introduce Dr. Arthur Basu, who received his PhD in political science from University of Calcutta. Presently, he is a professor of international relations, Jadavpur University. He has also served as departmental chair, director, School of Media, Communication and Culture, and coordinated PG diploma course on human rights at Jadavpur University. His publication includes Press and Foreign Policy in India, North-South Relation, a Post-Colonial Research Agenda, co-author, Revisiting Ram Mohan Roy's Political Agenda, Democracy and Democratization in the 21st Century, co-editor, Locating Cultural Change, co-editor, apart from several book chapters and articles contributed to edited volumes and national and international journals of review. Now, may I request, sir, to please address the audience. Over to you, sir.
Thank you so much. Am I audible? Okay. So first, I must thank the organizers for giving me this opportunity to share some thoughts with. My mind goes back some 15 years. In around 2005-06, when I was invited to the college to deliver lectures. So after all these days, it's very nice to come back again. And now, as per the title of the seminar, I am going to focus on the issue of secularism in India, the health of secularism in India. Basically, my contention is, my starting assumption is that secularism at present in India, India is in deep trouble. And the responsibility lies on both sides, I think. On the one hand, of course, there is the rise of the very aggressive majoritarian Hindutva brand of politics, which questions the loyalty of the minorities, or for that matter, there are different kind of laws are being promulgated, love jihad laws, anti-conversion laws, CAA and all these things. And there are also instances of physical assaults on members of the minority community on different pretexts. So this is one side of the story. The other side of the story, I would argue that those politicians who have always sworn in the name of secularism, they have also failed to live up to the expectations. For example, they have often been found to pandering the clerical classes. For example, in many cases, if you look at their treatment of the minorities, their attitude to the minorities, we find that in many cases they support expansion of the madrasa education. They support the Urdu language, the cause of the Urdu language, the cause of the Urdu teachers, madrasa teachers. Similarly, in many cases, the imams and other categories. And I would add that other issues which very rightfully belong to the core of minority rights, I think, or minority issues, I think. There is a question of their poverty, their education, illiteracy. The issues Professor Chatterjee was facing in the morning session. I think these issues received rather short shrift, even from this secular category politicians. So my proposition is to look into these maladies of secularism, revisit the contours of secularism, and to suggest some alternative visions and strategies for dealing with the situation. Now, if we begin by referring to the different understandings of secularism that are prevalent, on the one hand, we have the typical Western notion of secularism, which is marked by a strict wall of separation, which calls for a strict wall of separation between state and religion. Now, we know that the Indian constitution makers, they did not really accept this notion, but we find that in Pandit Nehru, we have a very strong admirer of this particular version of secularism, a strong secularism, we can say, a strong, very idealistic view of secularism. Nehru was an agnostic, and in keeping with his religious views, in keeping with his position, he put locks upon the Babri Masjid, at the time of after independence. Then he very made it a point to dissociate himself from the inauguration of the revamped Somnath Temple. He also, through the introduction of the Hindu Code Bill, he also sought to give Hindu personal law an orientation towards greater gender justice. But at the same time, he also made an exception for Muslim personal law. And it was understandable that at that point of time, it was important to reassure the Muslim community, the members of the Muslim community. And we can also say that those were largely referred to as the members of the left liberal community in India, academia and activists. They also largely share the Nehruvian vision, the Nehruvian version in this connection. A second conception of secularism, perhaps the dominant one, is it derives its parentage from Gandhi. And Gandhi, it has been argued that the uniqueness of his vision of secularism was, it has been argued that he had spiritualized secularism and he has secularized religion. For example, he always introduced himself as a very devoted, a very devout Hindu, Sanatani Hindu. And yet, at the same time, he stayed away from all temple visiting and rituals and other kinds of things we usually associate with a very devoted practitioner of a religion. Instead, he always emphasized that we have to uphold the truth in all religions. And as a result, his take on secularism was quite widely known, and it formed the bedrock of the idea of secularism that underlay the Indian Constitution. Professor Chatterjee pointed it out very clearly, that very correctly, that the word secularism was not introduced in the original Constitution, but the secular values, the secular ideas were writ large upon the Indian Constitution. It was very difficult to ignore or to overlook this stamp of secularism on the Indian Constitution. And this secularism was largely drawn upon, or it drew upon Gandhi's idea that the state should remain equidistant from all religions on the one hand, and the state should be equal and impartial in its treatment of all religions. So that was what is popularly known as the Indian variant, the Indian take on secularism. But since the 1980s, once again, Professor Chatterjee was talking about a very marked shift that came over the relationship between religion and politics in India, of treatment of the minorities, etc., since the 1980s. And this third variant we can call a variant popularized by the Sangh Parivar in general and the BJP in particular, and they called it positive secularism. But this was in essence a call for going back to, or a strict adherence to, the Western doctrine, wall of separation doctrine, that state should not in any way tilt in favor of any particular community. And here, their primary target was the kind of exception Jawaharlal Nehru made in order to, by way of providing assurances to the members of the Muslim community who had suffered a trauma, of course, at a time of the partition, trauma in many senses. Now, the Sangh Parivar version argued that this amounted, on the one hand, to a departure from, a deviation from, the idea of the state treating all religions equally. You were tilting in favor of one religion, one particular religious community. And on the other hand, politically speaking, they argued that it was nothing but a kind of vote bank politics. So roughly, these are the three variants of secularism, three and understandings of secularism, three approaches to secularism that we can look at within the Indian political parlance. Now, my first submission is my discussion will be divided into two parts now. And first, I would like to argue that while the word secularism was incorporated in the Indian Constitution, the preamble to the Indian Constitution very formally in 1976 during Mrs. Indira Gandhi's regime, when the emergency was in full cry. Now, these self-proclaimed secular politicians, beginning with Mrs. Gandhi, they basically failed to implement secularism, basically live up to the ideals of secularism. And if we take very brief examples, a very short two, along the decades of 1970s, 80s, and beyond, in order to substantiate my argument. If we start with Mrs. Indira Gandhi herself, we find that she weaponized religion. We can take the example of his dealing with the Punjab crisis. At one point of time, it was the Congress party, it was her Congress party which backed General Singh Bhindranwale, who ultimately became a kind of Frankenstein. Or for that matter, in the 1980s, when Mrs. Gandhi returned to power for a second time, she developed her connections with the RSS, cozy connections with the RSS, and took their help and used Hindu religious motifs, religious appeals in order to win elections, in order to, or during the Jammu and Kashmir elections of the early 1980s. Again, if you come to Rajiv Gandhi, we find what has been popularly described as competitive communalism. And I should not elaborate much, because on the one hand, we have seen that in overturning the Shavana judgment of the Indian Supreme Court, he basically bowed to the pressure of the Muslim orthodox sections of the Muslim community. And as a kind of a response, perhaps, he had to succumb to the other group, the Hindu fundamentalists, and he allowed the opening of the doors of the Babri Masjid. We have already referred to the padlocks placed upon Babri Masjid doors, the controversial Babri Masjid doors by his grandfather. And we find Rajiv Gandhi was ordering the reopening of these locks. And in fact, he also, in the context of the 1989 elections, he also allowed the Shilanyas of the Ram Mandir by the VHP, Vishwa Hindu Parishad. We move on to Narasimha Rao. Once again, we find that Narasimha Rao, he perhaps sought to, his way of dealing with the Hindu, the rising tide of the Hindutva forces, the Ram Janambhoomi movement, was to try to co-opt or neutralize its edge. And he famously said that I can fight BJP, but how can I fight Lord Ram? So that was his way of looking at the issue, and ultimately, as we know, that it failed to prevent the demolition of the Babri Masjid. On the other hand, if you look at the NDA governments, NDA 1 and NDA 2, the first government was led by Atal Bihari Vajpayee, and yes, Atal Bihari Vajpayee definitely, he talked about positive secularism. We have already tried to explain the meaning of positive secularism. And we also know that he sought to carry out what he understood as a Swaraj Dharma during the Gujarat riots, the infamous Gujarat riots of the day. But at the same time, he was definitely a soldier of the Hindutva Brigade, and he categorically described himself to be a Swayam Sevak for his entire life, a lifelong kind of Swayam Sevak. On the other hand, if you come to the regime of Prime Minister Modi, the contemporary times, we find that all pretensions about secularism is virtually discarded. And we find on the one hand, there are both physical and ideological attacks, persistent attacks upon the minority communities, construction of the Muslim other, that has become one of the major vote-catching, vote-winning strategies of the present ruling party. And on the other hand, we have seen that the Prime Minister of a secular state participating in the Bhumi Pujan of the Ram Mandir, of course, in the context of a Supreme Court verdict. And it, for all practical purposes, it simply wipes out the line of distinction between state power and the Hindu religious functioning. So, my first point is that in contemporary India, secularism has become a very debatable issue. Some argue that it is very, very, very phony or vacuous kind of term. And politicians of belonging to different political parties, politicians of different hues, we have noted that very unfortunately, they have failed to carry out the responsibilities under a secular constitution. They have either pandered to the orthodox elements of these communities, or they are tilted to the orthodox elements of that community. So that way, secularism, the health of secularism at present in India is definitely not at its best. Now, this brings me to the second part of my discussion. And here, I'd like to talk about a few responses, precisely two kinds of responses to this scenario. The first response is a typical liberal response. We can characterize it as a typical liberal response, that it basically refers to the liberal constitutional values, liberal values enshrined in the Indian Constitution. To briefly outline its major features. First of all, it talks about paying respect to pluralism, tolerance, and diversity in India. The second thing is that they argue that religion is definitely a very important part, a deeply important part of our everyday life, but it must be relegated to the personal realm. It must be treated as a very personal matter. And therefore, we should sincerely work towards making religion irrelevant in the public sphere, in our public life, banishing religion from public life as far as possible. And a third thing, the most important thing perhaps, they argue that we should focus on individual rights, individual freedom, individual choice as far as religion is concerned. And we should not talk about community entitlement. We should not talk about community entitlement. So as far as the debate between the individual versus community is concerned, it proposes to take a very pro-individual stance. And individual is prioritized, individual is not subordinated to the community. So naturally, it has implications for the personal laws which belongs to different communities. We often talk about Muslim personal law, but at the same time, we know that there are other personal laws, including Hindu personal law, which has not yet been completely modernized, revised and modernized. That we have to keep in mind. And here, when there is an issue, there is a reference to the rights of the individual versus rights of the community. This particular standpoint, the protagonists of this particular standpoint, they choose the individual end. So, to simply put, to give a simple example, that if you want to keep the state truly equidistant from all religions, if you want to make governance in India truly blind to religion or community sentiment, you have to ensure that if you stop subsidy for Hajj, on the one hand, you also have to ensure that a government should not manage, should have no role in managing Hindu religious temples or, for that matter, funding Hindu pilgrimages either. So that is, according to them, a kind of celebration of liberal values and living up to the call of secularism in the Indian context. Religion should be relegated to the private space. Rights of individuals should be prioritized. Rights of community should take a secondary position. And this is important for making India truly secular. This is fine as an ideal really worth striving for, no doubt. But a question can be raised. That is, can religion become a private matter in a country like India? When we see that religious imageries we find all around, we find religious rituals taking place in public. We find, in fact, many of the Indians, as we are convinced now, that they also find that religious beliefs, they very much constitute the cornerstone of the nation itself. In fact, these critics take a step ahead and argue that look at the constitution itself. Look at the freedom of religion provision in the constitution. It not only gives you the right to profess and practice your religion, but also propagate your religion. So propagation of religion, preaching, this is definitely a public happening, public event. So even in the constitution, you have this reference to this public character of religion in India, the place of religion in the public space. In fact, it has also been argued that if you look at the decorations, the adornments of the constitution, these adornments are to be found in the original copies of the constitution, which is presently kept in great upkeep. Now, it also shows elaborate artworks which focuses on various religious figures. Religious figures from different religious backgrounds. Ram Sita is there, Buddha and Mahavira is there, Akbar and Guru Gobind Singh is there. So here also we find that a document like the Indian Constitution, it also reflects the enormous diversity, enormous religious diversity, the very vibrant religious diversity the Indian society presents. So their question is that whether this dizzying diversity can be simply brushed under the carpet and simply be replaced by a coerced sameness in the name of secularism, as the liberals allegedly demand, that you put your religion strictly locked into a private space and banish it from the public sphere. So if we accept this criticism, and I think there is a point, these critics do have a point, then I come to my last argument. An alternative viewpoint can be put forward. That is, the majoritarian politics of Hindutva can be combated not only from outside, that is by referring to the constitution, the constitutional values, the values of secularism, the values of pluralism, reference to constitutional morality. All these are very important. All these are very cherished kind of values. But an alternative strategy could be to subvert this majoritarianism, majoritarian politics from within. And it has been argued that this can be done through a saner practice of religion. Now the argument goes something like this, that a state needs to remain, of course, a secular state needs to remain scrupulously neutral, scrupulously impartial, no doubt about that. But as far as the political parties are concerned, political parties, after all, they're supposed to mediate between the state and the society. So it should be their responsibility. They should try to find out if they can engage in a counter strategy to combat Hindutva politics like this. We often talk about soft Hindutva. Now, soft Hindutva, when we talk about, is applied to various non-Hindutva parties. Now, where it's mentioned, it doesn't carry really a very positive sense. Okay, in fact, those politicians who we consider practicing this kind of soft Hindutva, the critics argue that they are basically acting as a kind of B team of the Hindutva politicians, Hindutva parties and Hindutva politicians. For example, during election campaign, we have seen Rahul Gandhi referring to his admiration for Lord Shiva. Akhilesh Yadav has been referring to Lord Krishna as the god of the Yadavs. Then you have our Arvind Kejriwal. He has introduced himself, or he is trying to build an image image as a follower of Hanumanji. Now, my point is that these are attempts to create an alternative space within the Hindutva pantheon, within the pantheon of Hinduism, and to argue that it is not only the very attacking, very aggressive brand of Hindutva propagated by the BJP or the Sangh Parivar, which focuses on Lord Rama. And this Lord Rama is very, a very aggressive image of Lord Rama, who is the warrior. So, as against this unifocused idea of Hinduism, idea of the Hindu as a follower of Lord Rama, these different religious figures, they are invoked in order to put forward a more diverse, a more pluralistic identity, a more pluralistic understanding of Hinduism. Now, the point is that this should not be a simple vote-catching politics. If you are serious about it, if you seriously want to develop an alternative space, a strategy for combating Hindutva, you have to engage with the people, with the followers of Hinduism, and sell this idea of an alternative, to this followers, to this Hindus, Hindu political constituency. And the outcome will definitely, on the one hand, it will detoxify Hindutva, the aggressive Hindutva, and the platforms, various kinds of platforms, religious festivals, some other kinds of gatherings, where people come together, where people intermingle, cutting across their various kinds of barriers, class barriers, caste barriers, gender barriers. This kind of platforms could very well be utilized for rebranding political Hinduism. But going beyond pluralizing the Hindutva political space, the Hindu political space, these political parties, they are not only responsible to the Hindu community, the Hindu constituency, they are equally representative of the minority communities. In fact, we have seen that they have their own ways of dealing with the minority issues, which to me, of course, remains largely questionable. Now, an alternative way could be to build bridges across communities, bring the communities together. This was what Gandhi argued. This was what Gandhi understood when he talked about understanding the truth in all religions. He talked about dialogues, interfaith exchanges. And his point was that in order to be a good Hindu, you have to be a good Muslim, a good Christian, and XYZ. So this is another thing that needs to be seriously taken. So my point is that you have to use the societal platform in order to combat the rising appeal of the very, very claustrophobic majoritarian Hindutva brand of politics. Now we have to keep in mind that there is no automatic connection between Hindu religiosity on the one hand and the majoritarian kind of politics propagated by the BJP and the Sangh Parivar. Actually, it was the members of the Sangh Parivar, RSS and others. They over time, they sought to penetrate these religious places. Social scientist Professor Badrinath, and he had elaborately researched into this aspect, that how they penetrated these various religious spaces, akhadas and kathamandas and other things, and they have propagated their own brand of Hindutva almost to have it in the fact that, you see, this is what should be the common sense. Now, if a brand of Hindutva which thrives on community hatred among communities, which thrives on a kind of religious bigotry, which talks about distance between various religions. The alternative could also be propagated in the same way. And why not take up the cudgels on behalf of this kind of agenda? Of course, the liberals will not really be very happy. I think they will be skeptical rather for any such suggestion. They have skepticism regarding any kind of organized religion, the subversive potential of this kind of organized religion, the kind of religious frenzy they can, it can. You can see there are instances that religion has a subversive connotation in a more positive sense. For example, when Ambedkar embraced Buddhism, he was basically trying to use it for propagating the message of equality. We have heard about liberation theology. We have heard about, we know about the implications of the Bhakti movement in medieval India. So that is my point. On that note, I'd like to stop. That in order to, in a society like India, which once again, to quote Ambedkar, from cradle to death, it is wrapped in various kinds of religious cover. And we have already seen the way the Sangh Parivar, BJP in particular, they have meant, rift the difference of this kind of religion-based appeals. So if you want to combat them, what I'm suggesting is, instead of trying to deny religion its proper place in the public sphere, we should try an alternative. That is to engage the Sangh Parivar through their own instrument, that is propagating a different version of religion, and thereby to take on the toxic narrative of the Sangh Parivar. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for your valuable thought. You have visited the contours of secularism and have pointed that rightivists and the secular leaders have not really done much to improve socio-economic parameters of the minorities or prevented their misinterpretation in media. Thank you so much, sir. So now I would like to move on to our next speaker, Dr. Maidul Islam. He is Assistant Professor of Political Science at Center for Studies in Social Science, Calcutta. Previously, he has taught political science at Presidency University, Kolkata, and at the Tata Institute of Social Science. He was also a fellow at the Indian Institute of Advanced Studies, Shimla, as a palindrome. Hector Piling, Senior Hume Scholar at Brasenose College. He studied political theory for his doctoral thesis in the Department of Politics and International Relations, University of Oxford. His research interests are in political theory, political ideologies, populism, identity politics, Indian Muslims, contemporary West Bengal, and Bangladesh. As a political analyst, he also appears for Bengali news channels and occasionally gives expert opinions on Indian politics, West Bengal politics, and terrorism to various national and international media houses. His books include Political Theory and South Asian Country Narratives, Indian Muslims After Liberalization, Limits of Islamism, Jamaat-e-Islami in Contemporary India and Bangladesh. Sir, may I request you to address the audience, please? Over to you, sir.
Yeah, thank you very much for a very kind introduction. So am I audible to all
Yes,
the participants of the seminar? So it was really a great pleasure to have been present all throughout the day, right from noon. And it was quite a privilege to listen to a very enlightening presentation by Professor Devi Chatterjee, and then subsequently equally illuminating talks by Professor Arthur Basu and Aryan. I insisted that I will speak on the class issues in Indian governance. And I'm kind of in the middle of writing a paper, which will be is kind of work in progress. So basically the title of the paper is something like Class Matters in Indian Governance. And a lot of things have been already been articulated in the last 2.5 hours. So how much time would I get? Half an hour or 20 minutes? So I can arrange the talk accordingly. Half an hour?
Sir, you have 30 minutes, sir.
30 minutes, yes. That's what, okay, thank you. Now, I also insisted that to the organizers that my institution is not Center for Studies in Social Sciences Kolkata, not the K, but Center for Studies in Social Sciences Calcutta, C. This is important given the fact that first of all, the name of our institution is so big that people always confuse. Although the generation that I come from and the generation before me, they were quite well aware of the institute and the center. And but nowadays, maybe because of the large proliferation of several centers, our center is somehow kind of forgotten. But the C is important because it's in the registration part. It's Center for Studies in Social Science Calcutta, C. So CSSSC. Although journalists, editors, and including academic editors, they always kind of confuse with Calcutta with Kolkata. But even the name of the city has changed, but the institution name, because of the registration part, it's intact. So okay, I'm kind of will try to put forward an argument that in the context of the last 30-40 years of the increasing assertion of caste and religious identity, which have been already being highlighted by previous speakers, whether class is all that important in governing India, and maybe I will also take an example of current contemporary West Bengal, which will help me to present my case. Now, if we look at the political economy of the classic text of political economy on Indian political economy of development, then we could then start with Pranav Bardhan's political economy of development in India, which was a kind of Radhakrishnan lecture in 1984, got published by the Oxford University Press. And it suggested that during the Nehruvian regime, or what we call the dirigist regime, there were three important classes which were quite dominant in matters of making state policy, and it had influence in matters of state policy. The first one was the industrial capitalist class, or the big business houses. The second one was the rich peasants or agrarian property holders, big land holding kind of peasant groups. And the third one, the bureaucratic managerial elite. Now, these three had a profound influence in terms of making policy making, and these three classes, it actually mattered in terms of Indian governance, how Indian state would implement its policies, would frame policies, and these three competing classes had a kind of influence on both the state and the central governments. Now, as far as the industrial capitalist class was at that time, had a major role at the central government in compared to the rich peasant class, which were more influential at the state level. And of course, the bureaucratic managerial elite was another group which was kind of was responsible for implementing these policies, and some of the policies which were at that time during the what we call the pre-liberalization period was was deeply also influenced by the bureaucratic managerial elite as far as the implementation of certain policies are concerned. Now, after India got what we call the policies of liberalization, privatization, and globalization, which roughly started from the 1980s, although there is some literature which says that right from the Janta government, these policies were slowly emerging, but certainly it got more visibility during the Rajiv Gandhi regime, with technology coming in, Sam Pitroda and some people like these kind of technocrats which were kind of emerging. And more specifically from 1991, with the new economic policy getting very formally implemented under the then Finance Minister Dr. Manmohan Singh, we kind of had now 40 years of, if we 2022 and 31, so 91, so 30 years of neoliberal economic policies, or what we call the policies of liberalization, privatization, and globalization, which were implemented. Now, in these last 30 years, of course, there has been a proliferation of the mandir, the mandal, and the market. So these three aims, which is very much expressed by the classic political science literature on Indian politics, which argued that the Ayodhya Ram Janmabhoomi movement, which was the mandir, became a very major electoral issue, and it still had, still recently, it also helped to mobilize people behind that issue. So the mandir issue. The mandal issue, which was being largely talked by Aryan, and so the caste politics, caste-based mobilizations, those are there. But at the same time, you also have a market where this class factor and kind of interrelationships between different classes have a role to play. Now, if we look at the last 30 years, then what has happened is that in the older regime of competitive classes between industrial capitalists, the rich peasants, and the bureaucratic managerial elite, there is a disproportionate increase of power of the corporate capital, which is, of course, the industrial capitalist classes. At that time, it were few, but now the numbers have proliferated, particularly after the liberalization, of the economy. Because before there were very some powerful known few business houses like the Tatas or the Birlas or several some of other known business houses. But after liberalization, there are a lot of new entrepreneurs who have joined this what we call the super elite, or the top business tycoons of India. And partly due to the growth in the information technology, the growth in the pharmaceutical industries, and several other ventures like the real estate, the retail market. This is something where new industrial corporate capitalist elite has now emerged, and it has a huge. This particular class has now a huge influence over both the central and the state governments, where correspondingly the rich peasants' negotiation with the government has over the years have been quite diminished, and as a class it is no more that kind of a powerful class. Now one could come to this whole new issue of the repealing of the farmers' laws. I will come to that, but these are exceptional cases where the rich peasants could mobilize, over a 1 year of continuous movement and demonstration, and it forced the government to repeal the 3 farm laws. And this is after 30 years of tremendous farm crisis, farm distress, farmer indebtedness. And of course, it paid huge electoral dividends in Punjab with a kind of a new party, the Aam Aadmi Party, which was able to articulate certain progressive voices as well as progressive issues and there was a kind of a joint mobilization from the erstwhile Lohiites, the communists, and Gandhians, and of course the strong backing of this rich peasant lobby, which is very much there in Punjab. Now, but this is something which I will say that it's largely an exception if you look at the overall orientation of India's economic policies are concerned. So the corporate elite, it has over the years has now created a huge influence in the media, and it now owns most of the media, or directly funds the media. Media is of course run by their advertisements. So whether it's print or electronic, so it's very much, their presence is very much there. And at the same time, the rich peasants lobby has diminished, particularly their influence over the government. Now, so whatever happened to the bureaucratic managerial elite? Now, the bureaucracy is still there, but what we are now increasingly seeing is that there is an emergence of a parallel set of technocracy. Now, one could find Sam Pitroda as one of the initial kind of technocrat in this in the context of liberalization. Of course, there were also before, during the Nehruian regime, there were very eminent technologists and technocrats who had very contribution in different fields of science and technology. But I'm not going to that. I'm just saying that this whole in the last 30-40 years, during the period of liberalization, privatization, globalization, this set of technocrats which are now emerging, and so if you look at the Niti Aayog, which is a kind of a replacement of the Planning Commission, you will see a lot of lateral entry persons coming to the policy making. And particularly after the 2012 Aadhaar kind of architecture, the new kind of governmental architecture, which is very much technology centric and technology linked, you will find all these entrepreneurs or some kind of knowledge-based economy, whether it's Nanda Nilekani or some other economists who have been very much there, or just coming from policy think tanks who are very much important players in policy making. So this is a kind of not just a bureaucratic managerial elite; it's a technocratic elite which is now emerging, and it has certainly played an important role in governing India. So this is a class which is largely coming from middle class or upper middle class background, well educated. Most of them have degrees from foreign universities and had some a career either in academics or in policymaking or in journalism. Someone like Sanjay Baru had a career in journalism, and so those kinds of people are emerging now. So this is the kind of architecture that's now coming up. So one is the corporate capital elite. That's one pillar, and you have bureaucratic managerial elite with formal bureaucrats through proper competitive tests like IAS and IFS and formal training. But at the same time, there's also at least some openings of lateral entry technocrats also joining them. And the rich peasants are kind of declining. So these two kind of classes have emerged in India in terms of policy making of how to govern India. Okay, so these two classes, and in terms of the elite classes, these elite classes have huge say in policy making decisions. Now, in opposed to this particular ensemble of corporate capital and the bureaucratic managerial elite in the current state of affairs, in the current avatar, you have the people. So if you look at the Indian state, so you have capital, then you have the state, which is formed by all the apparatuses. So bureaucratic managerial elite part of that state. You have the political leadership part of the state. You have the judiciary, and you have the army, police, again, who are part of the bureaucratic managerial elite. So this is one state, which is the kind of Indian state, you could say, and backed by the new and humongous power of the corporate capital. And in opposed to that, or at least those who are being governed, are the people. Now, these people is not a homogeneous set. These people changes from one province of India to another province. Now, how you define these people, there are a lot of this is a kind of very fuzzy zone, and it also is so flexible that the nature of these people actually changes from one province to another province. So in the southern states, you have regional nationalist kind of political articulation, which majorly defines a kind of people, or which creates a certain kind of people. In Bengal of late, these regional sentiments are also growing. So, and that's why Aryan was saying that because of the caste, lack of dominant caste mobilization like North India is not that, cannot be possible, at least in near future. We don't know what will happen from 20 years from now, but certainly in the last 10, 15 years, or even during the left, it was not that possible. And it's not very much possible caste-based kind of mobilization for a successful electoral kind of a victory, even in the foreseeable future. So you have certain elements of either class or linguistic-based sentiments, which is sub-nationalism, people say. That's another kind of defining a people. So Bengali people or the people of Bengal, something like that, where symbolism of vernacular tradition is very much important. And that's already emerging even in certain Western states. These people are very different. So let's say North India is again a very different kind of people, where people is governed by the very dominant idiom of religion, and marginally by the Hindi language, but very much dominated by the religion, let's say. So how do you then govern these people? And of course, these people is also fragmented along several occupational groups. So you have large informal sector labor force, and then large peasant communities, small land holding in India, fragmented land holding in India, where you have small peasants, landless peasants, and migrant labor. So it's large informal sector labor and very small petty producers, petty traders, and you have hundreds and thousands of occupations within these people, let's say. And politicians of any political party will have to earn their votes. In other words, they need to earn the consent of the people to rule, right? So in terms of governing the people, you need consent from them. And how do you earn this consent? Either you mobilize around, caste and religion, which is already a tradition in certain states. But in some states, that's not that kind of a tradition. So how do you govern them? And in the last 30, 40 years, where you have tremendous inequality, which is also emerging, given the fact that the inequality between, let's say, the top 1% and the rest of the 99%, even for the top 10% and the rest of the 90%, is huge. And let's say even the inequality between the middle class and those who are the very poor people. And several reports and several data, whether you take the World Bank data, whether you take the Oxfam report data, it all says that increasingly inequality is the main issue. So maybe not that poverty, because poverty reduction has taken place in terms of the calorie intake and all sort of parameters, how you define poverty. Of course, there are confusion. I'm not going into that because of the paucity in time. But largely the inequality is a major factor. And so how do you then govern these heterogeneous population groups if you have so much inequality? Now, Indian state, right from the 1960s, 70s onwards, one could say, although before in the 1950s and 60s, during the heydays of planning commission, it was a developmental state. But what has happened in the last 30, 40 years is that the developmental state's orientation has changed. So instead of universal rights of certain things, like whether it's universal public distribution system or promises like universal health or promises like universal education, whether those were implemented or not, that's another matter. But at least those promises have been now being more inclined towards very targeted beneficiaries. That and this regime particularly has already said that you don't need subsidies, so give away your subsidies, and those subsidies should go to the poor. So this is and these are certain schemes where it has been, so that the Ujjwala scheme, the gas Ujjwala scheme, was precisely on the basis of that middle class should give away their subsidies. So those kinds of things are there. Now you basically, because these poor and large number of poor and the large informal sector labor force and a very significant number of lower middle class, they are also voters. You need to also feed them. So what is happening is that now you have very different creative kinds of dole-centric policies of the government, and there are several kinds of doles, and each state has their own set of doles, and no one state would say that we are not giving doles to the people, because this is now part of the new governing policies of both at the state governments as well as for the central governments. It's true for all kinds of governments, irrespective of which party you are, whether you are the BJP or Congress or the regional parties or the left. It's whatever. AAP is of course a regional party. Trinamool, the southern parties, TRS, Orissa, BJD, or YSR, whoever, or the left in Kerala. It's all about giving doles, and these doles are also targeted. So these are they are exclusionary categories. They're exclusionary parameters on the basis of which that certain doles will be delivered to these sections of the population. Okay, so this is something which is increasing. And now with Aadhaar and authentication and everything, there is also an effort that there is no duplication. And this is what as far as the West Bengal is concerned, you will see that this whole Duare Sarkar or this whole different schemes within the state-sponsored schemes, whether it's Shastro Shati, Konyasri, Jubosri, Rupasri, and recently launched the Lokhi Bhandar or student credit card. These are essentially done, whether there is no duplication, that one beneficiary should not get the other. There is also an effort to that, you see, and increasingly because of Aadhaar, it's easier to actually trace a person whether the person is getting more than one benefit. For some years that has been the case, but given the crunch, the financial crunch on state, given the financial burden on the states, this will be more streamlined. This could be more streamlined, at least from the bureaucratic point of view, from the governmental point of view. Whether the political leadership will take that kind of decision is a completely different matter. I don't know. But at least from the bureaucratic point of view, there will be always a pressure that, given the fact that there is a financial burden, you need to streamline those schemes. Now, what is happening in terms of these doles is that this is essentially very much most of the doles, at least, is very much class centric. So you have, of course, there are certain doles which is meant for only the scheduled caste, scheduled tribe, and the minorities. But then there are a lot of doles which is very, very much class centric. And Lokhir Bhandar is something, or Shastro Shati. These are certain schemes, or even Konyasri, or a lot of schemes which are essentially targeted to certain populations, irrespective of caste and religion. So this is something one could say. Now, one could say that there is a gender component to certain schemes, whether it's Konyasri or Lokhir Bhandar. But there is also an argument from the point of view of the government that given the fact that women are more discriminated, and in a poor country women are more poorer than men, it's better to actually give a direct transfer to the woman, where the woman will not only be benefited, but the next generation, her children, will be also benefited with this kind of woman-centric schemes. Now, what is also now emerging, and that's a kind of a challenge in terms of this whole a tussle between, I would call a tussle between the bureaucratic state and a technocratic state. Remember, I already pointed out that although the bureaucratic state is there, and this state is there for a long time. If you look at the pre-colonial state, there was also a bureaucracy. The colonial state had a bureaucracy, which was then passed over to the post-independent state, or let's say the decolonial state, where you also have a bureaucracy. But at the same time, in the last 30 years, 40 years, there is an emergence of technocrats. And so Manmohan Singh, Sam Pitroda, or different economic advisors, these are classic examples of technocrats. And even today, at the level of political management also, you have people like Prashant Kishore and all. They're coming as kind of a technocrats in doing a very different kind of job, or formulating certain kind of policies for the government, which would ensure re-election of government. And that has happened in 2021 Bengal, where it started with Didi Ke Bolo program and this Duare Sarkar, whether the schemes are actually going to the exact beneficiaries. What are the exact complaints? What are the complaints of those who are getting or not getting? So these kinds of very, very sophisticated, technology-centric, data management, dealing with big data in a very corporatized manner. So this is something which I think will increasingly have a major role to play in Indian politics, as well as a major role to play in Indian policy making. So in that sense, the class which of course is not defined by a very traditional old Marxist idea of class, that I'm not talking about. But I'm talking about class in terms of looking at the income groups and how those income groups are a basic parameter for this dole-centric state, which is at the same time bureaucratic and as well as technocratic. Now the tussle is between the technocracy and the bureaucracy, which is now emerging again. The technocracy, which is large, which is, of course, they think that technology will solve every problem. Of course, we all know that technology cannot solve each and every problem. There is also a limitation of technology. But at least the aspiration is that technology will resolve all the problems of society. Now, technology will, of course, be is very fast. You need to update technology. Look, I'm just giving you an example that we are all talking via the Google Meet model. There are several similar other kinds of apps that you have, whether it's Zoom or Skype. Now you need to update continuously your phone or the technologies that you use. Now, so technology is very, very fast in terms of updating, and it's a fast changing medium. Whereas bureaucracy, which real person, you deal with these people at the office level, your clerks, the Sarkari Babus, the officers, the secretaries at different ministries, they are slow. In terms of, at least the Indian experience is such that they are inimical to change. Now the burden of technocracy is that the bureaucracy should be fast, should change, should reform, should reorient themselves, And this is something which is a continuous at the policy level. You will always hear that, look, we had a very nice presentation with some CM, or we had a nice presentation with the Prime Minister, or we had a nice presentation with that particular ministry at the state, but because of the bureaucratic bottlenecks, this was not done. And so the technocrats who are in alliance with both the state as well as with corporate capital, they have this kind of what we call a kind of complaint towards the bureaucracy, that the bureaucracy is still very much slow in India, and it doesn't actually work. Even if the political decisions have been taken for a certain project to be implemented, right? So what I'm trying to say is that these are certain competitive classes which has, over the years, in the pre-liberalization era, there was a very different kind of correlation of class forces which were governing India. And in the post-liberalization India, there is a new set of classes which have now emerged, and they are now governing India. And governing whom? The people, which is again kind of fragmented on the basis of caste, class, community, gender, whatever. But the policies, a lot of policies which are very much dole-centric or very much are targeted, and it is again kind of quite defined by income or classes. So look at this particular example of economically weaker sections, which is a kind of counter-narrative to the whole idea of caste-based reservation. So even the very fact that economically weaker section is something which is a very, very class-centric terminology. The BPL, below poverty line beneficiaries, that's again very, very class-centric kind of a category. And now this has been already there. The BPL has been there for a long time. But the economically weaker section is a kind of category which is very, very much class-centric, and this is somewhat the Indian state has to offer to calm down a certain section of population, not to get agitated against the government. And there are, of course, political reasons. There are certain support bases of different parties which will try to suffice those suffice the democratic demands of those groups. Now, a lot of these doles, which are again class-centric doles, one could say, are not earned after a prolonged movement or a prolonged kind of agitation, and this is something which is important. That these are policies which are being packaged and framed by both the bureaucratic and technocratic elites before the articulation of the democratic demands of these groups. So if you compare with the recent example of the farm movements and the achievement of the demands of repealing the 3 farm laws, now this is very different from, let's say, introduction of Lokhir Bhandar or Ujjwala or Ayushman Bharat or Swasthya Sathi, or I'm just talking about both the central and the state government schemes. It's very different from this particular issue. So nobody demanded that we need Ayushman Bharat. Nobody demanded that there was huge protest demonstrations throughout India to say that we need Ujjwala Bharat or we need this particular scheme. Or similarly in the state also, there was no huge demonstration of gherav or agitation or whatever the different forms of agitations are, to say that, look, we need this particular scheme of Konyasri or Yugosri or Swasthya Sathi or Lokhir Bhandar. So this is a preemptive tactic on behalf of the state to deliver on certain issues which are relevant for the population. So already the lack is there within the population, but the state could not preempt that what this population needs. In other words, if you look at the leftist kinds of governments, the leftist kinds of governments were run by the party, and the party in the classic Leninist terms had what they call an advanced consciousness than the people. So the party is kind of having an advanced consciousness to the people. You could find this kind of advanced consciousness even in the religious tradition, the prophets and the messiahs and all. But here, in this kind of bureaucratic managerial kind of state, the state has advanced consciousness than the people. So the state thinks that, we know what you need. So, okay, so this is a Lokhir Bhandar or this. Now, these are of course good and these are beneficial. And given the fact that you have, people need certain relief in this dire, in the dire situation of, hunger and inequality and several kinds of grievances that they have, that the state, in other words, are already framing a policy before any articulation of democratic demands. And this is what I have called in my recent book, in a chapter where I defined how state populism works, is the logic of governance. How the logic of governance works is a kind of it works through a preemptive strategy or on the behalf of the state, and this preemptive strategy is basically to create not only beneficiaries but targeted beneficiaries, but at the same time it is happening even before any articulation of democratic demands. So I think I will stop here because I've already taken my half an hour of time, and so in terms of a recap, briefly, so the Indian state and the kind of classes that had tremendous influence in the policy making of governing India from the pre-liberalization period has of course changed, and today what we have is the huge dominance of corporate capital, but at the same time there's also an emergence of both the bureaucratic and the technocratic elites, and the creation of certain dole-centric schemes very much targeted, and it's also preempting the exact or even not the exact, but at least the lack that the people have, and the people need to be fed, to be clothed, or because they are powerful vote banks, and the post-COVID situation will only see the reproduction of this state with more fast technological innovations, and at the same time we might also find a kind of a contradiction between the bureaucracy and the technocracy. Now, how these two will be resolved, that we will have to see probably in the next few years. Maybe in another decade, one could have a possible answer. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Dr. Islam's presentation on class matters in Indian politics was enlightening. Thank you for taking us through the dominant caste and their roles in policy-making process in India. The proliferation of mandate, mandal, and market as important elements in Indian politics was also elaborated on. More dialogues between policymakers, bureaucrats, and various other stakeholders, beneficiaries is also important. Thank you so much. And now I would request Munmana ma'am to take over, please.
Thank you, Sujata. Sir, on behalf of the students of the department, there are some questions for Professor Basu. They are asking whether India is a secular country or not. Like, what is the role of civil society in India and in West Bengal, in both the cases, to enumerate the secular spirit which is there in the constitution. To protect the secular spirit, what is the role of the civil society in West Bengal and in India? Sir, your take on it. And there are another question for Professor Moidul Islam. Sir, the question that the students are asking is, do you see various populist schemes having any effect in reducing inequality in Indian and West Bengal scenario? Like, flushing cash in the economy was mostly sought after by Professor Abhijit Banerjee in reducing the inequality. Sir, what is your opinion in this regard? The students are asking. Thank you, sir. Sir, I would request Professor Basu to address the question first, and then to Professor Islam. Sir, should I repeat the question?
Hello.
Sir, Professor Basu, should I repeat the question?
Yes, please.
Sir,
Yes,
they are
please.
asking
There
what
was some connectivity issues.
Sir, they were asking, the students were asking that what is the role of civil society in India and in West Bengal to protect the secular spirit that is enumerated in the constitution?
Okay, I think two questions are there. One thing is that what is understood by secularism, and other is that role of
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
in preserving the secular spirit.
Yes,
Okay, as far as the first question is concerned, secularism, as I try to argue, that the constitution definitely upholds a particular view of secularism, and which I venture to contend that it largely derives from the Gandhian ideal that a state will maintain equal distance from all religions, equations, impartiality, etc., etc. But at a point of, in terms of its practice, I tried to show that there were departures. There were very gross departures from this ideal, and largely what I see is, instead of the state or the ruling parties running governments, both at the same and in various states, the kind of ideas there is comparative pandering to the conservative elements of different communities, both the majority and the minority. So that was a kind of practical application of secularism, which to my mind was definitely, it did not reflect the spirit of secularism content in the constitution. So in this connection, we must say that the civil society has to take a very important role. And I offered, that is, one strategy to counteract the Hindutva offensive could be initiating a kind of dialogue exchange between various religions and the political parties who basically mediate between the society and the state. They can provide kind of a lead. Of course, political parties always go by their own political calculations, no doubt. But if they are serious about upholding the spirit of secularism, then they can very well try to combat the message of the majoritarian Hindutva politics on the societal level, engage with different religious communities, both majority and the various minority communities, and spread the message that an alternative understanding, even of what could be called Hindutva-based for Hindu-oriented politics, an alternative understanding of Hinduism, a more pluralistic understanding of Hinduism, could very well provide a kind of alternative, not only a kind of substitute space, but also a potent instrument, a potent strategy to combat a very homogenizing kind of narrative propagated by the Hindutva politics. So my entire point was that civil society should do two things. One is it should keep a watch on ism propagated by different political parties in power or out of power. This is one thing. And the second thing is that the civil society could take some proactive initiatives in order to define or redefine or emphasize, reaffirm the values of secularism contained in the Constitution of India. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for your enlightenment in this regard. We, as a part of the department, on behalf of the students, are enriched by the knowledge which we have received through this program today. Sir, now I would like to request Professor Islam to address the question by the students. Sir, shall I repeat it once more?
I've heard the question. I'm just trying to write it. So, if I have heard it correctly, then basically the students are asking that can doles reduce inequality, and the particular policy of cash in hand, given the policy being articulated by Professor Abhijit Vinayak Banerjee, whether that's a kind of a suitable kind of policy. If I have heard it correctly, then say it yes, and then I can answer. Is it?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes.
Okay.
They're talking about the various populist schemes only. Yeah.
Really populist schemes, yes. So first of all, no populist scheme in this world can reduce inequality, because inequality is fundamental to the very structure of capitalism itself. Populist schemes can only reduce a state of complete desperation of certain groups to a relatively better stage. So let's say a person who are really poor and really desperate, and they are in real crisis. So the populist schemes can only give a little bit of relief to them. Okay, and these are all relief-making measures. Okay, so make this world what they call a humane, or what you call the human face of capitalism. That's how the schemes are all about. It can't reduce inequality, because inequality will be there in this world. Point is that in the last 100 years, this inequality has shot up, and all sort of studies by whether it's Thomas Piketty or Nancy, even a study by Abhijit Banerjee and several other studies actually said that, in India and China, the inequalities are rising, but it's also true about the Western world, particularly in Britain, US, and France. So inequalities will be always there. As far as cash transfers are concerned, I think it's a good policy, given the fact that in the context of demonetization and then later the COVID-19, the large informal sector need some cash to spend. They don't have cash in their hands, and this will of course create a demand in the market, which is going by the old Keynesian logic. Now, the whole idea of universal basic income that Abhijit Banerjee, Raghuram Rajan, and several other economists have been, including Pranab Barthan also, have been suggesting for a long time is something which any governments, any sane government should implement. At least this is something we need at this kind of crisis, particularly after demonetization and COVID-19, as far as India is concerned. But even for the world as a whole, universal basic income is something which is a demand which is now increasingly getting more prominence, and that's something which the governments have to decide. The point is, the tussle is that where will you get the money from to have the universal basic income. And I think that's again the classic tussle that will emerge, is that you need a political leadership who has a political willingness to tax the top 1%, or even the tax the top 2, 3, 4, 5%. That the economists will have to decide. But it's always the case that the top 1%, is effectively gets less taxed, whereas the large middle class, it gets taxed, and in order to bail out the poor. And this has happened several times before, even while you bailing out the poor after big economic crisis and any kind of financial slowdown. So tax. So you need to tax the rich, but at the same time, in India, particularly in the context of the huge influence of corporate capital over, and this corporate capital is again very crony, because there's only 4 or 5 oligarchic houses who will have a major role to say in the government policy than, let's say, the others. So, but even if you look at the top 100 richest persons or richest houses in India, the corporate capital is being less taxed. It has been given all sort of land, forests, or natural resources at a throwaway prices sometimes, or these investments of a profit-making public sector, profit-making banks. These are now out for sale. I don't know how, so in this context, how will you extract more money in order to dole out the poor in a massive scale, given the fact that India, the population is still increasing in India, and the demands for basic amenities of life will also increase, given the fact that the population is also being kind of increasing. So I'm quite skeptical on this particular issue. As a policy for cash transfer, it's a good policy. The point is that how much, there's of course a limitations to every policy. So how long can you extend it, or how long can you make this policy as a kind of permanent policy? Now, can you do that? If you want to do that, then of course you need a kind of what you call a social state or a welfare state. Now, India is nowhere near to the welfare state today at present. So this is a kind of a challenging question for both the political leadership and the policymakers. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, sir. There is a follow-up question from the students again, and it says that if it is a state's job to reduce inequality and still it continues to serve the interest of the rich, what should be the way out?
Any state is at the end of the day, particularly the state that we are living at present. It was in the Nehruvian state was a very different kind of state, and of course there were debates whether those state was actually serving the interests of the big landlords, big rich peasants, and the industrial capitalist elite, or it was a relative autonomy of the state where the state was kind of benefiting very different sectors of the population. Now, those debates are not going into it, but today this state is certainly tilted towards the big corporate capital, which is I was just presenting this in my argument. No, it's the state's job, of course, but the state is doing this job out of a pressure, because any political party who currently enjoys state power or will have to sustain its political power. That's the very logic of political party. The political party is not a charitable institution. It has to win elections, and it has to not only win elections, but it has to also stay in power for long, right? It is because of the logic of sustaining the party for a long time, they innovate these kinds of policies, or at least they tell the bureaucrats that how we can better govern, or so that we can earn the consent of the people, right? So it's not just the state's job, but at the same time, the state is being situated in such a structure that it is kind of compelled to do this particular act of doling out this very different kinds of what you call populist schemes. But at the same time, it is also the role of the people which also matters, in terms of whether our citizens in India, they are not conscious and aware of their own rights. They don't know the basic fundamental rights of the Constitution, partly because the Constitution has been largely being very much kept at the level of judiciary, the judicial elite, and the bureaucratic elite, and the very educated, and it's very much English medium constitution. We hardly have very genuine, authentic translations of constitution at the local languages. We don't have the culture of the basic rights of the people through a pedagogic system of what are the rights of citizens, right? So this is something which those who actually argues, I will say the progressive forces in this country, should then educate the people to know about their rights and mobilize people on the basis of certain rights which have been either guaranteed by the Constitution or promised by the state or the political leadership in power. And it is throughout the sustained political mobilizations that things might change. Now, politics is never static. So you can't say that, okay, there is a one government which is now at the helm of affairs and things will be all hunky-dory, things will be all fine. That's not how it works. Politics is an ever-changing and at the same time, it's a continuous process. So one government will come, another government will replace it, then there will be some change in the government in the future. It may not be in the near future, but maybe some in 2 terms or 3 terms, whatever the case may be. But there will be change. And the issues of politics will also change. So this is something what one could argue, that this is the necessity of our 21st century politics, that are new idiom and a new nomenclatures of political or new political language has to be also emerge. Now that might emerge from a new generation which is more tech savvy, relatively more educated than the earlier generation, They might have the power of technology by bypassing certain gurus or babas or some other religious figures. So this is something which we need to wait and watch. But it is a new generation which might actually create a new language of politics. At present, what I find in India is the new generation is somehow kind of caught between a complete obedience towards the state or towards political leadership, or there is an anger, there is an anxiety, anger, anomie, all those kinds of emotions. But certainly there is a lot of anger, which is an anger without a cause. There is a lack of channelizing those anger into more creative ventures in terms of a more constructive mobilization against and a united mobilization against the major, what you call the major antagonistic force. So you must be very clear to whom are you fighting for and for what cause are you fighting. And this is something I find a problem with this generation, with the generation which is what we call the millennial or post-liberalization generation. Now, it might change given the fact that there will be increasing unemployment, given the fact that you have robotics, machine learning, and artificial intelligence taking up new jobs. So there will be a huge set of disruption in the economy. Already there are. Now, what Indian politicians are cunning is that because religious sentiment is an age-old tactic to completely distract from the major economic issues of employment, education, healthcare, different, and to some extent, whether these doles are properly getting to the right beneficiaries and not. One could also articulate those kinds of demands or very new demands maybe. Those are somehow, even if these are important issues and they always play an important role in governing India, the religious sentiment and religious-based mobilization, because it has paid rich electoral dividends in the last 30, 40 years, at least in the case of India, and to some extent in some parts of the world also increasingly it is happening. Increasingly, it's kind of religious majority and nationalism, which is also emerging in very different kinds of what we call populist authoritarian governments, that these schemes or these kinds of economic rights-based issues becomes less important at the level of political articulation. So this is something which all progressive forces in this country have to unitedly think, creatively think. But the point is that today, what we call progressive forces, I find a number of regional parties, whether it's Trinamool or AAP or in the southern parties or the left in Kerala, they are progressive forces. But they have a huge issue with the Congress. and the Congress is somehow not quite performing in those states where they have a direct fight with the BJP. Now, of course, the Congress is a classic liberal party, and they could certainly articulate a lot of these Keynesian policies, and some of these policies were already being implemented during the UPA regimes, but given the lackluster performance of its political leadership, the Congress is crumbling. One could have to think whether in another 10 years AAP will replace the Congress in certain states where there is a direct fight, whether AAP will replace the Congress vis-a-vis the BJP, you see, because now we are in a BJP system. Remember the first 20 years of 47 to 67, it was a Congress system. But now from 2014 onwards, there is now an emerging BJP system where the BJP has become for the first time the dominant national party of India. But if the southern eastern coastal plains, whether it's Jharkhand or particularly West Bengal, Odisha, Andhra Pradesh, Tamil Nadu, Kerala, the southeastern coastal plains, where the BJP is certainly weak and regional forces are strong. So So you need a creative and united kind of front without having, infighting. And this is classically the case in UP, where you have no creative, united kind of front, where everybody is fighting each other, and BJP just, got a very handsome majority. So even in the context of a long farmer suicide, now in a smaller state like Punjab, where the rich peasants, and particularly the Punjab, the constituency which actually gave up leadership, it won. So the progressive forces have to creatively, engage with each other, have a coordinated effort, and to think that how you need to give a proper, real challenge to the current regime, which I think has not delivered to deliver to a lot of promises that they originally made, and a lot of policies that should have benefited the huge informal sector and huge number of poor in this country. That is not happening, and it is more beneficial. The regime is has been benefiting more towards the very tiny few corporate houses. So tiny number of corporate houses. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Islam. As you have rightly pointed out, India has already shifted its goalposts when it comes to fulfilling international commitments of improving socio-economic parameters. From universal claims, we see benefits given out for targeted groups on one hand, and on the other hand, corporate elites have taken up spaces in various areas, including the spaces of debates, deliberations, leading to shrinkage in that space of debate. Politicians across spectrum have also failed to protect the secular constitution of India, as Professor Basu has pointed out. And I'm so prompted to rather point out to the work done by Kalpana Karnabiran here, who argues that the very words, "we the people," makes our constitution a common good that everyone has a right to protect. And it is not for politicians but us, we the people of this country, to protect the various ideas that India stands for. On that note, I thank you all. And for the formal vote of thanks, I would now request our IQAC coordinator, Dr. Shantanu Chakraborty, to take over. Shantanu, over to you, please.
Thank you, Madhurilata. Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of IQAC, let me begin by expressing heartfelt thanks to all the speakers for making this one-day webinar a success. I thank them for taking time out of their busy schedule and sharing their thoughts with us. I also express sincere gratitude for the constant encouragement from our respected principal ma'am, Dr. Urmila Ukil. This program could not be possible without the help of Ananda Mishra, Tamagna Rai for their technical support. The teachers of Sarojini Naidu College, teachers of other institutions, non-teaching staff of our college, students who have all joined us today, a big thank you to all. Last, I would like to congratulate the Department of Political Science for organizing this webinar on such a relevant theme. Thank you all once again.
Thank you. It was a pleasure. It was a learning experience. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Just a second, participants, feedback form will be posted. So on submission of that feedback form, you'll be given the participant certificate. Thank you so much, Professor Basu. Thank you so much, Dr. Islam. Thank you so much, Professor Chatterjee.
Thank you.